Last August, as some may remember, there was a total eclipse of the moon. I'm not sure which parts of the world it happened in, but I know that it was supposed to happen on the west coast at 3 a.m. in the morning. My boyfriend and two roommates had all been looking forward to it for a long time because there hadn't been a lunar eclipse in our town since I was in the third grade. I was 19 when this eclipse happened, so we decided to make a night of it and kind of make it a special occasion. We all had the next day off, so we had dinner and a few drinks. At about 1 a.m. in the morning, we left to go for a walk and figure out where we were going to watch from. First, we decided to try a roof, but once we got up there, we noticed that you couldn't see the moon past the trees, so we all started to climb back down the ladder. Now, I am terrified of heights. Once I get up on the roof, I am like a caterpillar. I can't stand, I just wiggle around. So my boyfriend decided to go down first so he could catch me if I started to panic and fall, which was very likely. My roommate held the ladder from the top. While I was going down, I looked through the window into our living room. The ladder was in front of the window. On the other side of the room, there is another window the same size, so they face each other. The curtains on the opposite window were closed and the lights were off. This is where it gets weird. I stopped because I saw a shadow on the curtains on the other window. At first I thought it was my own shadow, but it was so big. I started to wave one of my arms, but the arm on the shadow didn't move. Then I realized that the lights were off, so there really couldn't be a shadow for me anyways. I was just staring at it while everyone was trying to talk to me. Then all of a sudden, the shadow raised one of its hands in a fist and then started to walk towards me. It looked like it was walking in slow motion, but it was still moving across the room fast. I got so scared, I let go of the ladder and fell. I was caught and not hurt, but I was shaken up so much I started to cry. I went towards the street, and then once everyone got there, I said what happened. And they responded that it might be a good idea just to go for a walk and stay out of the house for a while. We walked to the park, watched the eclipse, then headed home. Once we got back, we were sitting there watching the Colbert Report, and all of a sudden, one of my roommates turned to my boyfriend and said, "When your uncle was alive, did he used to agree with people a lot, but then add something to what they said?" Weirdest question to ask about the man, I know. If anyone has an idea of what this might mean, please, please let me know. Well, my boyfriend looked at her and was like, "Well, yeah, I guess so." He used to kind of like go, "Oh yeah, you're right, but," then add something. Well, my roommate started crying and just got up and left the room. The next morning, her boyfriend, who also lives there, was sitting with us watching TV while she was still asleep. We asked him what her deal was, and he told us that she saw a man sitting in the chair next to my boyfriend, and he kept interrupting her thoughts. She would think something, then she would hear him say, "Oh yeah, you're right, but," then add something. Apparently, when she asked my boyfriend that question, the ghost did the same thing, but then added something scary, which is what made her cry. Apparently, she wouldn't even tell her boyfriend what he said. All she would say was that he told her to ask that question, and then he got really mad when my boyfriend answered. Today, I'm going to share with you my worst paranormal experience. I don't know if it was paranormal or something demonic. This incident happened to me when I was in my village again. It was summer holidays. My sis and I were at our village. My parents could not come as they had some work. In my village, we usually sleep on our house's roof during summer nights. It was a full moon night. After having dinner, we were preparing to sleep. My grandpa, sis, and I were the ones who slept on the roof. Grandpa didn't feel comfortable, so he slept downstairs. While going to sleep, I took my grandpa's phone to play games as my phone's battery was dead. So, we went to sleep. Grandma made the bed and we laid down to sleep. I was sleeping in between my grandma and sis. One thing I forgot to tell you is that my grandpa has a habit of waking up at night and taking small distance walks on the veranda of the house, so he always sets an alarm in his phone to help him wake up. Now, going back to the story, I was playing games on my grandpa's phone when I fell asleep. I woke up at night to the sound of the phone's alarm ringing. It was 2 a.m. I switched off the phone and was about to sleep when I saw my sis standing at the edge of the roof, facing the other side. I was quite baffled to see her there at that time. I asked her to come back and sleep. She said she would come back just in 2 minutes. I was feeling quite sleepy, so I turned around to sleep and got the biggest shock of my life when I saw her sleeping right beside me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I turned around and she was still standing there. I didn't know what to do. I again looked at my sis. She was sound asleep. But this time when I turned around, the girl standing on the edge had disappeared. I went to check, and as I came near the edge, I saw towards down my garden and saw the most creepiest scene of my entire life. A woman in a white dress was sitting on the swing, which was attached to the mango tree in my garden, and the swing was moving by itself. She wasn't applying any force, and the wind was not strong enough to have moved the swing. There was an eerie silence everywhere. No sound, nothing. I came back to my bed and started praying to God to make this night end as fast as possible. Every night, there used to be sounds of dogs barking, birds chirping, and so on. But not tonight. It was as if this eerie silence had grasped the whole world. I always had this weird feeling in my room, and I always thought it was just because I was young and afraid of my own shadow, but it never stopped me from locking myself in there and playing music full blast. I always ignored it, but until 4 months and 3 days after my 13th birthday, when I got my computer. I walked into my room, and as soon as I stepped in, I had this sudden wave of depression and sadness come over me. I didn't know what to make of it, so I ignored it and played some music quietly and began putting my birthday cards away so they didn't get damaged. I noticed once I had finished that the music was quieter than I had originally set it to. I turned it up to 76% and turned around to see that all the birthday cards were back in the exact same spot. I was so confused as I put them all the way back and left my room. I wondered if I had actually put the cards away, but no matter what I tried to convince myself of, it didn't make any sense. This is what started me believing in poltergeists. Nothing else happened for the rest of that day. The next day, after school, I walked into my room and saw that my music was on again, and my clock was set 3 hours behind. I knew that it was right that morning. I freaked out and walked out of my room. About an hour later, I went back into my room to do my homework and saw my computer and clock were the same as when I left earlier. I turned off the computer and reset the clock and sat on my bed to finish my homework. Once I finished, the strange feeling washed over me again, so I thought to play more music. This seemed to calm the feeling. Then, all of a sudden, a feeling of pure hate washed over me, and I stormed out of my room and slammed the door closed. As soon as it was closed, the feeling went away. That night, I woke up at 9:57 p.m., and I saw the pale face of a woman staring down at me in the darkness. Instinctively, I thought it was my mom. "Mom?" I said. The face smiled at me, then disappeared. I got up and turned on the light and saw that my cards were stacked next to my bed on the table and tied together with a ribbon. I turned on my laptop and saw that Microsoft Word was open. There was a message typed on it in the font Lucidia handwriting, and it said thank you. To this day, it still confuses me who the woman was. This is a true story that happened tonight. I was running around the house with my little brother. I was trying to get away from him because he kept jumping on me, and I was trying to write. I ran upstairs into the small hallway. I was standing in front of my grandmother's room, which was already open and the lights were off. I was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at my brother, saying something to him. Then I just happened to look over into my grandma's room. When I did, I heard something growl loudly. It didn't sound like an animal or any electronic device, such as an air conditioner, radio. It sounded like a human growling, as if they were mad. I looked into the dark room, a little shocked. It all happened so fast. I ran very quickly down the stairs and knocked my brother out of the way. Soon, I was on the couch telling the story to my grandparents. My papa went upstairs and put a light in my grandma's room. Then, he checked the whole room. There was no animal and no person in there. He came downstairs and told us that there was nothing in the room. So, I'm a little concerned to know what it could have been. I've heard of ghosts or demons growling, but I'm not sure. Please give me your opinion. First, I want to start with some background information. I live in a very small town. There is maybe 100 people in the town. It is very old. The town is shrinking, and some of the lights along the roads are going out or don't work. Recently, someone new moved in very near where I live, and we became great friends really fast, and for some reason, we always have these moments where we have the same exact thought, but only one of us will say out loud. Then the one who did not say it will say, "Dude, I thought the exact same thing." Although this has no relevance to this story, I felt I should include it. This story took place in the short, minute-long walk between our houses, and since the town is so small, I have two routes to this house, the road or my backyard. They each take about the same amount of time. Now, for the main part of my story. It was dark out, probably about 9 p.m., and for some reason, I was going to his house and I don't recall why. I might have had to get something, or maybe it was not so late and I was going to hang out with him. But it does not matter because it was dark. I took the road to his house, and for some reason, the walk always gives me chills. The road is lighted, but only at the ends, and sometimes the lights flicker or go out. This one walk was so much more creepy than the rest. I don't understand why it felt so much worse, but it did. Then, I noticed that I had two shadows following behind me. Shadow is in my shadows. I would not have found this too odd except for two things. One, the second shadow was not connected to me. Two, the shadows were facing towards the light source. Yes, there is another light on the end of the street behind me, but that was a bit too far away to be casting the shadows I was seeing. Then, just when I was near his house, I thought I heard a young woman's voice, probably around her early 20s, and I had no clue what it was, although I suspected it was laughter. When I got in my friend's house, I vaguely described the experience, and we both laughed. I think he thought I was just overreacting, which I may have been. After that, I kind of blew it off, but every time I take that walk in the dark, I always get a little creeped out sometimes. I will blast music to make the thought go away. I'm currently studying a Bachelor of Nursing. For our first year, we had a placement at a rest home where we were allowed to interact with patients and nurses alike to help us learn new skills. Among all of our duties, we each had a patient that we were to care for throughout the duration of our stay. My patient was called Mr. X. I changed his name for privacy reasons. Rest homes can be creepy enough, even at the best of times. This particular place I was situated at was an old villa that had been hospice during the late 1930s, but was renovated in the early 90s and a rest home wing was added to the original structure. The laundry room was the worst place to be alone. In the far end of the original villa, the laundry was cold, dark, and always secluded. When asked to venture in there, I would always run in and run back out.
Whenever I took Mr. X to the laundry to gather his belongings, he would say in an eerily casual voice, "Look, there's Steve, and he's here to see you today. He told me he loves when you visit him in here. It gets awfully lonely in the boiler room," and he would stare at the corner near the door that led to the old boiler room. It's just a storage space now. I could never tell whether Mr. X was joking or not, but I would laugh anyway, not wanting to seem afraid. Mr. X always joked around with me. He wouldn't let any of the other nurses look after him if I was on duty, because he always had so much to tell me about his week. He would tell me that I was his favorite nurse, and he was easily my favorite patient. One Tuesday I was doing my first night shift. I was very excited as patients in the day are much different than at night. It was one of those nights where the dark seems to press in on every corner, almost like a blanket. I felt a little uneasy as I was doing rounds on my own in the original building. When I walked past the laundry room, I seemed to get the feeling I was being watched. Thinking of Mr. X, I chuckled to myself, trying to think of Steve as a joke. I finished my round and headed back to the nurse's station. When the charge nurse asked how my rounds had been, I told her about how I always feel uneasy when I go near the laundry. She laughed and told me not to be silly. She said, "As a nurse, you'll get used to creepy places. Our main concern is the living, not the dead." She and the other nurses laughed for a bit, then she looked at me again. "Since you love the laundry so much, there are some sheets that needed to be cleaned for tomorrow. You can run them down." I thought she was joking. Unfortunately, she wasn't. As a new nurse, you get picked on a bit. It's all fun and games, and you eventually learn to live with it. I decided to just get my trip to the laundry over and done with, so I decided to grab the sheets and went on my way. It was so dark in the old building. It wasn't a cold night, but the breeze snuck through the small gaps in the old panels, creating a chill. I pushed open the door with my foot and reached my hand through the door to turn on the light before I went in, not wanting to enter in the dark. I felt a small breeze on my hand. I figured it was just coming from the paneling and heard a small creak, which I again put down to the breeze against the old building. I walked into the room and, out of habit, looked toward the boiler room. To my surprise, the door was slightly ajar. Knowing that doors in a restroom should always be closed, I walked over it to close it. That was when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A light moved behind the door. As much as I didn't want to look, I peeked through the gap and saw a man sitting on a bucket with a wild grin on his face. I slammed the door shut and fled out of the room, leaving the sheets on the floor. As I sped around the corner, I ran into a very welcoming face. Mr. X smiled at me, startled, and asked what was wrong. When I was done explaining what I saw, he laughed and walked towards the laundry. I reluctantly followed. Mr. X walked up to the boiler room door and opened it. It was empty. "Nothing can hurt you, dear," he said. "You are well protected. I can tell." He winked at me. I smiled awkwardly and told him it must have been my eyes playing a trick on me. He laughed again and turned to me. It was at that point when I realized that Mr. X wasn't allowed to be walking around at night alone. I offered to walk him back to his room. He walked towards me, stopping first to pick up the sheets I had dropped. "What kind of wife will you be if you leave your sheets all over the floor?" he teased. I automatically chilled out and laughed. He knew how to make me laugh. Mr. X did. I walked Mr. X back to his room and got him settled before bidding him goodnight and telling him I would see him on Thursday. The last thing I saw as I closed his door was him smiling at me lovingly and then turned his head as though to talk to someone. Thursday morning, I showed up at placement ready to start my workday. At handover, the nurse didn't mention whether or not Mr. X was due for a shower, so I wanted to ask her. She looked at me with such surprise. "Mr. X passed away on Tuesday morning. I'm sure you must have been told when you had your night shift. Didn't you think it was weird he didn't come to see you?" She then smiled sadly at me and walked off. I didn't think it was weird he hadn't come to see me, because he had. I had 3 more weeks left at that particular placement. For those remaining weeks, I was no longer afraid of the laundry room. In fact, I felt a calm, warm feeling whenever I walked past. I'm sorry my story was so long. I hope it entertained you or gave you chills. It is 100% true, whether or not you believe it. My cousins have been dealing with freaky things happening from the very beginning. They first live in an old farmhouse where mildly scary things happen semi-regularly. Lights flickering, footsteps, all the bit. At this point, it was just my aunt, uncle, and their oldest child, who was just a toddler. They then built a brand new house in a quiet part of town, and that's when things actually got worse. By the time their oldest daughter was a young teen, they had 3 more children who were all experiencing now terrifying things. Doors were slamming shut. They could hear whispering almost every night all around the house, and the oldest daughter was seeing a large man with bird-like feet and huge wings. She saw him on a couple of occasions just briefly, but described him as completely black without a face or any features, standing at the foot of her bed in the middle of the night before it disappeared. This family is very close with God. They attend church every Sunday and have a strong faith. But the family soon discovered this oldest daughter had been experimenting with Ouija boards and other dark things, and they packed up the family and moved to Central America for a year as sort of a fresh start, in hopes that they could return one with all this left in the past. While they were in Central America, however, things hit their peak. The sound of furniture scraping along the floors. My cousin described it like someone was pushing a bed from one end of the bedroom to the other over and over in the upstairs bedroom above her. Happened often, and they had horrible smells in their home like rotting meat. A couple of times in the middle of the night, they heard some very, very loud whispering. She said it was loud enough to hear clearly, but sounded breathy and hushed. Outside their window, speaking a strange language. Their dad speaks Spanish, and although this was in a Spanish town, her father confirmed that the voices were not speaking Spanish or anything similar, and there was no one outside when he investigated. One daughter also had a door slam in her face. She was terrified and began screaming and attempted to run to her sister's bedroom for help, but as she was doing so, simultaneously every single door in the house slammed shut. They didn't lock, so she was able to simply open them, but it was obviously quite terrifying. They had a pastor come to their home and bless it, although they said nothing changed. After a few months of living there, the youngest daughter in the family developed a severe illness and had to be promptly flown back to Canada for treatment. After they arrived back in Canada, strange things continued happening, but not quite as violent or often, just strange things off and on. Their motion-detected garbage lid lifts by itself and lights appear in the middle of the night. That was just about 10 years ago, and now things are starting to get very, very bad again. The youngest child of the family, the only son, went to university, and in the meantime, nothing even remotely strange happened in the home. He just returned from school about 2 weeks ago, and it seems like it has come back with him. He says he saw the dark bird-like man in his room at night and again on the stairs in the same week. He also says it speaks to him and tells him to do terrible things. He has never been involved in any dark practices and has had a very close relationship with God, so we don't know why it would attach itself to him or if that's even what is going on. I'm very close with my family and have witnessed a lot of these things firsthand when staying at their home, but I have no clue how to help or where to start. These experiences are absolutely terrifying for the whole family, and after 25 years of this happening, we really want answers.
When I was young, my grandmother owned a very old rustic country summer home in a small village about 3 hours away from a large city where I grew up. There was nothing particularly threatening about the outside of the house. To a casual onlooker, it just looked like an old quaint house, much like the majority of the houses in the village. During summer break from school, my parents would send me there, since my grandmother always took her vacations there, far away from the busy life in the big city where we all lived. Though I miss my parents a lot, and didn't get along well with my grandmother, I still, for the most part, enjoyed the large garden with its old apple trees, a berry orchard, and a large vegetable garden. The inside of the house had a very different feel to it. First of all, it was definitely very old and somewhat musty because it went unused for a large portion of the year. In one of the bedrooms where the wallpapers was peeling, you could see several layers of different color wallpaper, which makes me think that the house was owned by many people before my grandmother, though she had for many, many years. Though it had a sink, it did not have a toilet or a shower. Instead, there was an outhouse outside and an outside shower for summer use. There was one room in the house, which was added sometime after the original house was built. It was a slightly newer, open space with many windows, painted in a pleasant pastel color. It was located at the very back of the house. For some reason, my grandmother insisted that this particular room is where I would stay. If you were to simply look at it, you would find absolutely nothing threatening about this room. However, for some reason, I was terrified of staying there. My parents always remarked that unlike the other children, I was scared of nothing. I always slept with the lights off, never had any incidents where I was scared to be alone, and never had any childlike fears such as a monster in the closet, etc. So, my parents found it highly unusual that being 8 or 9 years old, I was absolutely terrified of this room. I would beg my grandmother to let me sleep in the bedroom in the main part of the house, but she always told me that I was being silly and there was absolutely nothing wrong with the room. Yet at night, with the lights off, I couldn't help but hear unusual creaking sounds, knockings, and what sounded like footsteps after my grandmother had gone to bed. Having never been scared of anything, I would pull the blanket almost all the way over myself, except for my eyes, out of which I could see faint black shadows moving along the corners of the room. I tried so hard to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but the extreme uneasy feeling never let up. I felt like something in the room could physically hurt me if it chose to. I told my parents and kept asking my grandmother about the room, but my questions were sidestepped, and I was always told that I'm just imagining things. And maybe it's because the room is sort of isolated from the rest of the house, and that makes me nervous. And of course, I got the usual explanation of it's just the house settling, etc. Since the house had no hot water, they couldn't blame the water heater. Things would go on like this every summer I was there. On a few occasions when I was allowed to sleep in the bedroom in the main part of the house, I felt much more at ease and was able to fall asleep much easier. In the other room, the uneasy feeling would keep me awake for hours, which was highly unusual for me since I never had trouble sleeping anywhere else. Yet, though significantly weaker, the effects of that negative energy permeated the entire house. To wash up before bed, we would heat water in the kitchen and put it in a basin. On numerous occasions, when I was washing my face or giving myself a sponge bath, since the only shower was outside, I had very strong feelings of being watched, to the point where I would do what I needed to do as fast as possible and would turn to look behind me, expecting someone to be there. One particular occasion I remember very clearly. It was broad daylight, and my grandmother went to the local market to buy food, while leaving me at the house by myself. I was about to go outside to the garden when I heard a loud female voice clearly calling my name from the living room. Utterly confused since I was supposed to be the only one in the house, I went to investigate. My grandmother was still out, and I confirmed that I was alone. Then I heard the same voice again, calling out to me urgently from another room. I was really freaked out and almost ran out of the house, but made myself go and see if anyone was there. I saw no one. When my grandmother got back from the market, I told her what happened, and she told me many people imagine someone calling their name when they are home by themselves. Even then, I thought it was an odd explanation, since I never had an occurrence like that before. And actually, I haven't had an occurrence like that in the nearly 20 years since then. Sadly, since I was still a child, I never found out the history of the house before my grandmother finally sold it after she was too old to maintain it. I don't envy whoever owns it now, though. Okay, one of my first experiences with ghosts was when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I was in Texas at my grandmother's house with my brother and cousin. We were sleeping in the living room, and I heard kids playing in the background. Then I heard a man call my name. I thought everyone else was up, and my grandma was waking me up. I stood up and opened my eyes, and there was no one there. It was also silent. I thought it was a dream, but then I heard kids again, and a man's voice started to call my name again. I now knew that this wasn't a dream. I ran to my grandparents' room and told them there was a man calling my name and that there were kids playing. My grandma said I was having a nightmare and to go back to sleep. I got into bed with them and went to sleep. About an hour later, my cousin came into the room saying that a man wouldn't stop calling his name. My grandma thought it was maybe a coincidence and told us to go to sleep. Nothing ever happened to my brother. A few weeks later, we got a call from them telling us that they were moving. My grandpa had gotten up about 1 a.m. to let the dog outside, and when he turned around, all of the dog's squeaky toys started squeaking, and there was a woman standing right in front of him, and it wasn't my grandma. They found a house and started moving as quickly as possible. We came down to help them. We lived in Oklahoma at the time, and my grandma told us that there was a family that lived in the house, and the dad and kids all died in the house fire. We never found out who the woman was, though. Thank you for letting me submit my story to you. This is one of the scariest, but I have lots of them. For as long as I can remember, I've been able to feel and see spirits that no one else could. It took me many years to discover what this ability was, and that I wasn't alone. I don't remember my very first ghostly experience very well, but my mother does. She told me the story many times. I was 3 years old, and we were visiting my grandmother at her home in East Boston. I walked into the back bedroom, my grandmother's room, and then back into the dining room and asked my grandmother about the man in our room. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She turned to my mother and quietly said, "She has a gift." She handed me a photo of her and my deceased grandfather and asked me if that was the man. I said yes, but he was skinnier now. My grandfather died of a brain aneurysm, a complication from a bout of meningitis in 1952, 34 years before my birth year. 1 year later, I was 4. We moved into a new home. Directly behind the house was the cemetery. We lived in that house for the next 14 years. There was a very heavy, eerie feeling that surrounded the stairs. Something watched you from the base of the stairs while you were in the living room, or at the top of the stairs. Every so often, there was footsteps and the sounds of someone falling down them. When you went to investigate, nothing was there. The basement was the worst place. It felt like something like a voice grip was squeezing your chest. I could never go down there. I was apparently the only one that felt it. My sister told me after she moved into her room down there that she never quite felt alone, and she'd get this odd headache, then smell something really awful. My dad made sure everything was perfectly safe before she moved everything down. There was no explainable reason for her experiences. I've had experiences outside the house as well, in cemeteries, in other people's homes. Recently, I began to investigate haunted places in New England with my friends. Since moving into my current residence in 2005, though, I haven't had any experiences at my home. We lived in a small farmhouse with a huge backyard, and beyond the fence, an even larger pasture. I was 11 years old when we lived there, and we, the kids, would always explore the backyard, especially at night, and play hide and seek all of the time. One night, in this big backyard, I was alone and looking out at the pasture when suddenly I felt as though I was being watched, and I turned my head to look at the house when I saw a transparent man looking at me, and then he disappeared a few seconds later. My uncle had died when I was 4, so I assumed it was him watching over me, and ventured into the house and went to sleep. A few minutes went by with no strange happenings when I went over to a friend's house and spent the night with her. We had a little bit of a slumber party and ended up sleeping in the living room when she woke me up at about 3 a.m. in the morning, apparently scared out of her mind, and told me she had woken up to go to the bathroom. That made her hair stand on end. Then saw a shadowy tall figure of a man with a pressed suit on, no hands or feet, and some kind of burlap bag over his head with a rope tied twice around his neck. So naturally, I thought she was kidding around, trying to scare me. So I got up and ventured into the direction she was pointing, when I felt this strange sensation, and boom, like magic, he was there. I ran back and told her that I had too seen it, and she ran into her parents' room and got them out of bed, and naturally, they told us there were no such things as ghosts, and told us to go back to sleep. We lay in the living room a long time, just watching this thing pace back and forth, and waiting for dawn so we could finally get some sleep. And about 5 in the morning, the visitor disappeared, and we soon fell asleep. Never in a million years, if someone would have told me this would be the beginning of a 19-year-old haunting, would I have believed them. But that is exactly what happened. Not just to me, but to my friend also. It seemed that this ghost visited us every night at the same time for almost 2 years at first, just pacing the halls, then turning things off and on, changing TV channels and radio stations, swinging things in the walls, just little annoying things that at our age would scare the crap out of you. One of the scariest nights I can remember was one night at my house. We were sitting on the bed eating ice cream when we both got that spooky feeling and fell silent, and we smelled something burning for a second, and then we heard the most guttural scary movie growl I've ever heard in my life. We threw our bowls and ran into the living room, where I felt the need to spoil the beans to my parents. Of course, they told me we were crazy and that our imaginations were great. A few months later, I was still insisting to them that something evil was in the home, and they kept telling me the same thing and began asking me if I needed help like counseling or something, but I kept fighting with them about it. By this point, even my brothers thought I was insane. A few months later, my parents decided to move because I stuck to my story, and they were hoping that if they got me away from my friend, that my imagination wouldn't work overtime. We moved about 65 miles from that town to another farmhouse that was even older than the last one. The same thing was happening, only instead of pacing back and forth, the figure began to float to my bedside, lean its head to the side, and make noises like it wanted something from me. This was a nightly ordeal for a few months, and then it began to start touching me. I could never see its hands, but I could feel the icy cold prickle sensation that came with it, working its way up my bed, to my legs, up my body, and even surrounding my head. Most nights, I was too afraid to move and afraid to cry out. so I laid in my bed, silently weeping. This went on for quite some time too. Then it began to lay in the bed beside me and touch me off and on all night, as though it was testing me to see if I was scared. And trust me, I was terrified. But when 5 a.m. rolled around, proof he would vanish. After a few months of this, in a ton of lost sleep, I finally got the nerve up to throw a pillow at him and yell at him. You know, things like, "What do you want from me?" And he began to put his head to the side, even more, and grunt, as if he was replying, "What?" Remember, the figure always had a pressed-on pinstripe suit and some kind of burlap bag over his head, with a rope that showed to be strung around his neck at least 2 times. So, I never saw a face or even heard him speak, anything other than the grunts it was doing that night. But shortly after my temper tantrum, it left. Finally, a few nights of peaceful sleep, until I was awakened by heavy footsteps in the foyer, going through the kitchen, which was not like him at all, and then the burnt smell again, and I was so afraid that I would hear the growl again, that I remember thinking my parents would surely find me dead in the morning from a heart attack. To make a long story shorter, here's a list of things that happened. After that night, I never saw the burlap ghost again, but strange things and sounds and figures would keep me up all night. It was like an open portal in my bedroom. I would wake up scratched up, heavy breathing in my ears, pressure on my chest, racing black silvery balls across the ceiling, red eyes racing through my room and disappearing, laughter, waking with my arms bruised as if someone had grabbed me, something cold that I always assumed to be a hand, because I felt something like a huge ring hit the bottom of my foot, grabbed me by the ankle, and almost slung me out of bed. A Bible was slung across the room and landed on my bed, as I had taken to the habit of filling my room with religious items. In one night, so much activity in my room that my younger brother was awakened and came in only to turn white and started screaming. And to this day, he will not tell me what he saw. So on to the future. I turned 18, still struggling with this haunting, or whatever you call it, and joined the military, and it still followed me. Even being stationed in Iceland, it was still up to no good, and my best friend, who was also my roommate, would say things like something is not right, and it was doing all of its little tricks again, like turning things on and off. But she seemed fascinated with it, so I told her the entire story, and she didn't seem to mind. She had just wondered what I had done to have this happen to me. Finally, a few years of peace without one thing happening. I'm now 24 and live with my boyfriend in our 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and nothing. Another year of peace when he tells me one morning that he felt like he was being choked in the middle of the night, and he has some bruises on his arm. I say nothing because I don't want him to think I am crazy, but it keeps happening, and then I wake up, look at the clock, and it's 3 a.m. again, and something is breathing heavy in my ear. I got up and went into our guest bedroom, and nothing, so I fall asleep for what seems like a few hours. But when I wake up, it is only 40 past 3, so I attempt to get up, and I can't move. Something is strangling me and hitting me all over. I struggle to get up, but I can't move. I can't even scream. This went on for about 15 to 20 minutes, and proof the struggle is over. This time, the attack is so severe that I consider calling a team of specialists out to see what it is, but I never did. Shortly after that, my boyfriend and I split up, and I moved to Oklahoma to be with my family, and nothing has happened since. Once in a while, I get a strange sensation, but but I don't think about it twice and just keep doing what I'm doing. And it has now been about 2 years since anything out of the ordinary happened. There are many more things that happened during this trying period of my life, but for me to write it on here would take a year at least. For those of you who read this and think I'm crazy, I can only say that maybe someday my little brother will tell me what he saw. My fiance had just died in our townhouse. This was in 2002. He had offed himself in the head. I went back later because I couldn't go back there for a while after he had died. Anyway, I went back and I kept feeling hand brush across my forehead. One night, I was in bed and was about to fall asleep when something grabbed my foot and was pulling it downward. I freaked out. I was the only one in the house. Then, I had a friend come over because I was afraid to be alone because of these things happening. My friend was downstairs and I was upstairs, coming out of the bathroom, and a dark floating figure floated right by me. It almost ran into me and would have had I not stepped back. It telepathically told me it was not here for me and that I had gotten what it wanted, and also would not look directly at me. I somehow felt like I was being protected by God, and the thing was actually afraid of me. I didn't feel scared. Later on in the month, I took a bunch of pictures of the townhouse because I wanted to remember the good times where my fiance had lived and been very happy together at one time. I was planning on moving because the memory of his death was just too much for me, and I always had this creepy feeling there since he had died. After I got the pictures developed, there were 120 photos in all of several different rolls of film of different things, and then the one that I had taken pictures of, the inside of the townhome. Out of all these photos, I had taken 3 of the exact place where he had died, and only those 3 photos were what appeared to be flames right in the place where he had passed. It almost looked like the portal to hell. Seriously. To this day, I cannot explain those pictures. They were taken with a very expensive camera. No other photos I had developed before or after that had ever had those flames in them like that. Just the 3 that were the exact location of his body when he died. My name is Malin, and I've just turned 21. I live in Sweden. In my parents' house, I've experienced some strange things that I really can't explain. My sister and I have always felt that there is a presence other than us. My parents don't believe in that kind of thing and have always told us that it's just our imagination. One of the first things I remember is that my father had gotten this stuffed animal that looked like E.T. He got it from his students as a present. I must have been about 4 years old and had recently seen the movie with my sister, and for some reason, I thought that E.T. was the most scary thing I've ever seen, so I didn't like this doll at all. In our basement, there are a lot of different rooms. In one of them, we had a huge box filled with stuffed animals. Every time I went down there, I took the E.T. doll and put it in the bottom of the box, under all the other stuffed animals. But the next time I went down there, the E.T. doll was lying on top of the others again. This happened repeatedly, every time I went down there. It didn't matter if I waited 2 days or 2 minutes. I of course asked my sister and my parents about it, but they swore that they had nothing to do with it. Of course it could be so that they lied to me every time I asked them, but I find that hard to believe. Anyway, I solved the problem a couple years later by giving the ET doll to one of the guys in my class. I constantly heard, and still hear, cracks and other sounds in their house, footsteps, and sometimes voices. They've always been there, and I guess I got used to it. But it took a few years before the next big thing happened. I was 15, maybe 16, and had moved down to the bedroom downstairs. I didn't like sleeping downstairs, but it was either that or a tiny room upstairs. One day, I was sitting in my bed, writing in my diary, when I heard a knock on my door. I was surprised because I was alone in the house and hadn't heard either the car nor the door open. I said, "Come in," but when no one entered, I got up and opened the door, but there was no one there. I thought it was strange, but went back to my diary. I had hardly any time to pick up my pen before I heard another knock. This happened a couple times and really scared me, so I locked the door and crawled under the covers. Then I heard scratching outside and froze, just to hear meow, one of my cats. At first I thought it was my cat who had caused the knocking, but I've never met a cat that can actually knock that hard. Another time I was in the bathroom upstairs. I just finished washing my hands and was outside the bathroom when I remembered that I left my watch in the shell in front of the mirror. I turned to go get it and took a step into the room when a bottle of lotion literally flew off the windowsill and landed in front of my feet. The window was closed and there was no wind to speak of outside. If the bottle had fallen off the windowsill because it was placed unstable, it would have fallen right down in the cat's litter box, but instead, it flew almost 13 feet. I calmly went out of there, closed the door, and got into my room and locked the door. I've also seen a boy in the basement, a teenager. He's not transparent at all. He looks as real as you and me. I've only gotten short glimpses of him, but I know he has brown hair and a green shirt. For some reason, I most often see him around Christmas and other holidays. I wonder why. Even though some of these things scare me, I've never felt threatened, so I guess whomever or whatever is present in my parents' house doesn't want to harm us. I'm one to be afraid of the dark, but there are feelings I get. Feelings that tell me to get out. Almost a communication from my location. The basement has been home to incidents experienced by me and my slightly older sister. My experience is weird. I went downstairs to retrieve something for my mom, when I was near the stairs, an opaque dark shade of gray temporarily blinded me. Whilst running up the stairs and wiping my eyes, I swore I heard something. My sister heard something too. She was on the downstairs computer once. It had basic features. She swore she heard something whisper something close to her name. My sister sprinted upstairs as well. Finally, my parents' room. I come in on rare occasions, like when the light and TV is on, or when my mom or dad are watching a good movie. My room is on the other end of the hall. I need to pass my parents' room. When I pass their room, I see strange things at the end of the bed. I see dark, almost impish figures. Once, I could have sworn I've seen red eyes. Now, for the sound. It is very creepy, yet inconclusive. I have no idea what the sound actually is. Once, when the family and I were in the living room, I heard a broom sweep in the back of the house. Weird part, there was no broom in the back of the house. Plus, just today, on 3/20/2008, I heard something in my room exhale. I know it wasn't me. That had freaked me out. The feeling. I think I may actually have been touched too. Once, when I was 8 or 9, I was watching a show on urban legends. I felt something run something gently down my back. It was around 10 or 11, but I got up anyway, and I went to the living room where I found my mom. I told her what happened, but she just said it was just a curtain. I lived in a home in North Salt Lake City that my children and myself had many experiences over the years that we never could explain other than it's supernatural. My husband, myself, and 2 children lived in this house for over 12 years. There's a family that now lives in the house, and I do not want them to cause any problems by giving them out the address of the house. I will say that the house is located on 5th North. My children attended Jackson Elementary School when they were young and graduated from West High School. My daughter was sleeping and thought she heard her name being called, and when she opened her eyes, there was a man with a beard sitting in a rocking chair, holding a hat in his lap. My daughter's bed was hung from the ceiling with chains, and her bed was 4 feet from the floor. My daughter said the man turned his head towards her and grinned at her. She also said that her rocking chair was even with her bed and was 4 feet off the floor. She told me she pulled the covers over her head, and when she peeked out over the covers, he was gone. My son told me of a man with a beard and a top hat sat on the end of the bed. My son heard his name called, and when he even looked in the direction of the speaker, the man sitting on his bed, the man grinned at him. My son pulled the covers over his head, and when he looked out, the man was gone. I was alone in the house for a few days, and on 2 different nights, I was awoken to the sound of music, violin, and tinky sounding piano. The lights were on in the kitchen and the front room. As I entered the kitchen from my bedroom, the music stopped and the lights dimmed, and as I entered the front room, the lights dimmed, and I found myself standing in the middle of the front room in the dark. I heard footsteps in the stairwell, and when I got to the bottom of the stairs, the lights were on upstairs. I started walking up the stairs, and with each step, the light got dimmer, and about at the 5th step, it was now dark upstairs. I could write about many other things that happened at this house. We never felt anything evil with our experiences, and it was always our own fear that scared us. I believe the house I grew up in was haunted. My family all makes jokes about how it was just all my imagination. There were several different occurrences throughout my childhood, nothing on a regular basis, but frequent enough for me to believe that something paranormal was going on there. I lived in this house from birth until 18 years old. I am now much older, and I still believe what I saw and felt was real and inexplainable. As a child, I always woke up in the night to get a drink of water or a snack even sometimes. I wasn't overweight, but it was a running joke in my house that I always had to get up to get something to eat at night. On several of these occasions, I would walk out of my bedroom down the short hall and into the living room where we had one of those old TVs that when you turned them off, the colors would dance for a short while and then go out. My parents were early to bed, early to rise, so I know the TV couldn't just shut off. But I would go out, and there would be a human face made from those colors that actually would just swim around when it was shut off. I watched the TV during the day, and it shut off, and always watched to see what the colors did, but they never made the face during the day, only at night, after the TV had been off for hours. The second occurrence that freaked me out completely was on one night. I was standing at the refrigerator, which was on the same wall as the doorway that led down to a small landing, which is where the back door was. and the stairs to the basement were. I always felt watched downstairs and couldn't stand going down there at night, even with all the lights on. I could do it fine during the day, but at night, it freaked me out. Anyway, the night I'm speaking of, I turned my head to the doorway. The only illumination was the light from the refrigerator, and there was a fully formed person peering around the corner from the side that would have been coming up the stairs. The horrible thing about it was that at first, I thought it was my stepdad, but then I got a look at his face a little closer, and it was his face, but almost evil looking. I swear it had red eyes, but that could have been a misinterpretation of what I saw. I ran back down to see where all the bedrooms were, and I peeked in my parents' room, and he was still in bed. I've never found an explanation of why it could have been his likeness, but I know it was definitely scary. Several years ago, I was planning on moving from the USA to Australia to be with my partner Craig. My partner and I would talk for hours on the web. What else can you do when you're 9,000 miles apart? My daughter, Catherine, who was 7 at the time, would often get in on it too. Her and Greg developed a very loving father-daughter relationship, even though he is her stepdad. One day, no different than any other, Greg and I were chatting. He wanted to talk to Catherine. I yelled for her. She was in another room, and I couldn't see the monitor. She came running and stopped dead inside the doorway. She could not see the monitor, and started wigging out, demanding that Greg shut his bedroom door, which was clearly visible behind him. She wouldn't move from where she was. We tried to coax her, but she wasn't having any of it. Greg got up and closed the bedroom door. Catherine ran into my lap and buried her face into my shoulder, away from the monitor. She wouldn't even look at the monitor. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "He's mean, and I don't want to see him." Completely caught off guard, I asked her who was mean. She answered, "The mean guy in the doorway." I asked her to describe him. She said he was tall, had red hair, blue eyes, and wore a dressy shirt. Deeper voice than Greg's. Oh, and by the way, Greg's voice is already pretty deep enough as it is. I tried to get more information out of her. That was all she had, or what she wanted to tell me anyway. I relayed what she had told me to Greg, and he just didn't get it. Catherine left my lab as fast as she had flown into it, yelled goodbye Greg from the other room. I wondered if she had seen something. I had episodes like that when I was her age, and they've continued. I asked Craig if she had described anyone he might know. He looked shocked for a second, and then asked me to wait. He went into the bedroom and came out a few minutes later with a pick in his hand. He looked at me, held up the pick, and said, "Wonder if this is who she saw." I asked who it was, and he said it was his grandfather Bill, who passed away in '92. It was 2007. Now get this. The pick was exactly the description Catherine had given. He was tall, red-haired, blue-eyed, had a dressy shirt in the pic. I asked Craig how he talked, and he said that Bill was old-school Aussie. His voice was deeper than most, and with the accent, it was even harder for Greg to understand him. I excused myself, and went and told Catherine who we thought it was. As soon as I said the name Bill, she smiled. She said, "I thought that was his name. That was the only thing I could almost understand." She seemed more at ease after learning it was his name. Greg, on the other hand, didn't know what to make of it. Apparently, her and Bill made peace and became friends. When I was leaving for Australia, she told me that she didn't need Bill anymore and wanted him to come over and watch over me and Greg till she got there. Gotta love kids. Fast forward a few years. Since my arrival here in Oz, I've heard a man's voice. Sometimes I can understand him. Other times, it's too deep and garbled for me to get. I ask him to repeat slower, and it gets him a little pissy. He has never told me his name, but I know it is Bill. I have that feeling. But lately, over the last year or so, I've been hearing a lot more voices. It's like being in a crowd where everyone is talking at once. I ask someone to step forward and talk only to me, but it just stays garbled. This is a weekly thing. It has gotten to the point where, when it starts, I simply say, if you're all going to talk to me at once, then I won't be able to understand any of it. What I was wondering is if anyone else has ever heard this, and if so, what did they do? Might this be more family members who saw that Bill was able to talk to us and want to try themselves? Or might it be something bad? Sometimes, not very often, I get a bad feeling when they start talking. Bill is still with me. I asked him, but he's given me nothing. I lived in Chicago up until I was 18 and had graduated high school. My grandfather lived in the house, and we lived on the first floor in the third flat apartment building we owned next door. We had the basement that was connected to the first floor apartment as well. The basement had 3 main rooms. The front room that led outside held a half bath, a washer, dryer, and 2 storage closets. This is where we kept our bikes and skates and stuff. The center room had 4 storage closets, the water heater, and the furnace. This was the room that held all my dad's and grandpa's tools. The back room that led to our upstairs apartment was where we had the deep freezer, old clothes, camping gears, old toys, etc. The center room was awful. Just looking at it, you felt like you were being stared down. Something was sending very angry energy out from that room. If you were in that room, it was just overwhelming and overpowering. It felt as if something was going to grab you and actually hurt you. None of us were hurt, but it always felt like it could happen at any time. My sister believed it to be female. I believed it to be male. This makes me think that it could have been a demon and was just appearing female to her and male to me. The stairs from the basement led to my brother's room. The stairs and the door were extremely creepy. We always kept it locked and bolted, but that didn't do much. It always seemed like someone was going to come bursting through the doors at any time. In the bedroom I shared with my sister, we have both seen strange things. I've seen a man a few times. He would start at the head of my bed, which happened to be by the door to the bedroom, and walk towards my closet. My closet and my parents' closet shared a wall. From there, he would kind of nod his head and then disappear. I could tell he was wearing overalls, work boots, and had gloves in his back pocket. He was tall, about 6 feet, dark hair, dark eyes. I could see all of this, but I could also see the other side of my room through him. He was kind of a misty gray color. I saw him first when I was 5, then again when I was 8, and the last time when I was 14. When I was 12, I felt a pulling on my blanket. At this time, We didn't have any pets that would roam loose, and there was no way for them to get out or even reach my blanket. I feel my blanket being pulled. I kinda grumble and try to pull it back up, but I can't. So I look at the foot of my bed, and there's a boy sitting there, grinning at me, gripping my blanket. I tell him, "You let go. I'm not scared of you. Go away." And he disappears. I pull my blanket back up and go to sleep. Then we just had weird things happen. Bread would slide across the counter. Things would be moved from one end of the bar to the other. Things would go missing for a few days. These types of things not only happen in our apartment, but in the upper 2 levels that we rented out. I was in Arizona a few years back. I was at the Sonoran Desert Museum outside of Tucson. It is more like a zoo than a museum. It was summer, very few people there, and a pretty warm morning. I was in the very back of the property all by myself, taking photos of the native cactus. I was completely alone and enjoying the beautiful outdoors. I suddenly felt a terrible sense of dread behind me. I turned and looked, and there was an elderly Native American man standing there. He was dressed in all black, long-sleeved black shirt in the middle of the summer. His hair was snow white, and his face was wrinkled. When we made eye contact, I felt like someone tweaked my soul. I started to walk, fast. I wanted to get back to the front of the zoo and be where people were. I was really moving, and every time I looked back, the man was about 6 feet behind me. He never seemed to increase his pace, but kept up with me no matter how fast I walked. He casually started straight ahead and kept walking. I made it up to the front and walked into the gift shop. He stayed with me the whole time. I decided to get the heck out of there. I hurried to the parking lot. All I wanted was to get into the car and get away. He was still behind me. When I reached my car, a coyote was standing by the trunk. I made eye contact with that animal. I can't describe it. It sounds nuts, but that coyote gestured towards the exit with his head. Of course, he didn't speak to me, nor did I hear a voice, but I just knew that the coyote would watch over me while I drove away. As I was about to get into the car, I turned back to look, and the coyote and the man were gone. I never went back. Every time I think of this, I feel as if I escaped something terrible. It's so strange, but it's like the coyote knew me, and I knew him. Thoughts, anyone? I don't take drugs, wasn't drinking, or overheated. I swear this happened. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it did. This happened in the summer, and at the time, my horse was living on an old farm not far from the sea. The farm was from 1925, with the original stables and barn. Anyway, on this day, it was only me and my horse there, and I had him standing outside while I was tacking up, since the weather was nice. Where he stood, he had the back entrance to the stables on the right side, and straight in front was the door to the barn. You had to go through the barn to get out. Everything was fine at first. Then, I got this feeling like I was being watched from inside the stable. I looked inside, thinking that maybe one of the other girls who had their horses there had come. But it was empty. I shrugged it off and continued grooming. Then, I noticed my horse had his attention towards the stables. I walked up to the door and looked inside, but again, there was no one. I got my saddle and stuff and started tacking up, and then my horse suddenly tensed up. He stood completely still, his ears forward, and all his attention on the entrance to the barn. I looked over, thinking it was a cat or something, but what I saw made the hairs on my neck stand up. In the barn stood a tractor. Behind us, I could see a dark figure. It didn't really look like a man. It was more, I don't know, liquid sort of. It stood on the one side of the tractor, partly hidden, and I could swear that it was staring back at us. It moved backward towards the back of the tractor and just vanished. Well, I hurried up with my Sadie, grabbed my helmet, and though I really didn't want to, I walked my horse towards the barn. Let me tell you, it was no easy task getting him to go inside, and when I got him inside, he refused to go anywhere near the tractor and almost ran out the other side, pulling me alongside with him. I'm having some problems with the spirit in my fiance's house again. For the past few months, the house has been dormant, and so we didn't worry much about what was going on in the home. We had one of my fiance's friends move in, and things were fairly calm and peaceful. Her friend, though, began to never stay at the house, and due to some issues, emotions got rather heated between the three of us. 2 days ago, her friend moved back after a fight, and activity has escalated in the home since then. Yesterday, I got an overwhelming sense of fear and dread while at the house, and I had an overwhelming headache come over myself. I began packing up my things and told my fiancée to pack her things because we needed to stay a few days at my house. She became overwhelmingly tired and had a headache, much like mine, and passed out. When she woke up, she wasn't herself, but quickly came back out of it. Then, I went to the bathroom, and when I looked into the mirrors from the corner of my eye, I saw something I couldn't explain. The thing was, though, it looked inhuman and comprised of only bones, I think, and it seemed to be wanting out of the mirror. I ran back, and my fiancée was packing and taking her time out, humming to the tune of an old music box that used to be in her friend's room. She started to have a play fight with me and threw a shirt at me, then casually kicked the door shut. The next thing I know, she screams and I kick the door open. She said I'd been standing in the mirror after I'd left the room. She seemed fine at the moment, and so I just watched over her as she kept packing. She began stalling again, though, and I told her we needed to get going, or we'd be late for dinner. She then told me that she didn't want to. She liked the house and wanted to stay there. I began to hear voices as well, other than hers in the house, and got drowsy, but kept my head about me. She finally was packed, and I got her to go outside for a brief moment to see if being out of the house would snap her out of the trance. She got rather defensive and ran off and ran under a doorway where there was a crucifix standing above the doorway. When she ran through it, she collapsed and then woke up again, perfectly fine and not remembering about the past 45 minutes, except for bits and pieces, like she had been dreaming. I've been having concerns that she may be channeling spirits by accident in her sleep and such, and this incident definitely confirms my suspicions. I'm psychologically drained from the mental strength it took the two of us to get out of the home. We're going back to the house in about 4 or 5 days, and figure it should be fine. Whatever this entity is, it fed strongly off the negative emotions that had built up in this house. I know at the strength it was yesterday, it would be much hard for me to face it and cleanse the house on my own, so we're leaving the house to settle and calm back down. By then, I feel this entity will have lost most of its power, and it would be the best time to cleanse the home and seal any portals that may have been opened in the home. I'm still a little bit apprehensive though, and if anyone could offer up some help, it would greatly be appreciated. If my fiancée is the target of any danger, I can pull through any fight normally and keep her safe, but I've been so drained, and I don't know if I can handle the cleansing of the home by myself. If anyone could please help, either physically or through even psychological support, it would greatly be appreciated. Hey there, I live in Akron, Ohio. About a year ago, I moved into my ex's house since it was nice, and well, we were in love. I lived there for about 6 months before she broke it off and decided to live in Ireland. I've been heartbroken for a long time, but I do remember some extra stuff that happened in that home. It's on Spicer Street in Akron, Ohio. About a month after I moved in, the first thing I noticed was waking up with her, and every single clock in the house, including the computer clock, wristwatches, etc., would be turned around 40 minutes ahead than what they were supposed to be. This only happened once, and after I arrived at class, she called me to explain how each clock had changed overnight. Later, she told me that the previous tenants believed the house was haunted and refused to move back in. They were both girls, I was told. We began to notice other things too, such as their stuff would get moved if we left the kitchen. The television would turn on and off. Lights would turn on and off if we left the home. Fan would move and not move. TV would turn channels with the remote being on the TV. And certain spots in the house would be unusually cold. She was scared at times, but I typically wasn't. I just thought of it as having a little kid in the home. I wasn't really worried, and I was confident that I'd be able to protect her from that kind of stuff. If you read some of my earlier posts, I see specks a lot, and I guess it gives me some sort of confidence, even if I don't understand them. My thoughts were confirmed, I believe, when I was sitting in the living room with her and thought I spotted a blonde-haired boy's face under her table. It looked a lot like a German kid, but naturally, I blinked and it was gone. There were 2 spots in the house that seemed really weird. The basement was odd, but not too odd, since students in the past used this place for studying. The oddest part in her house was her bedroom closet. I would step at the door and not go in. She refused to even sleep close to it. I was the one who slept closest to it while she slept between me and the wall. I didn't really see anything from it, but it did feel really weird, and it didn't feel like the kid. It was something else. Also, that closet was connected to the attic, which neither of us ventured into. After I saw the kid, I felt some sort of attachment to it. I remember she used to complain that sometimes my eyes would go completely black in the house. I'd usually counter it with me complaining about staring at me, as she slept as if I woke up around 5 in the morning, but we wouldn't argue about it. It was just weird. When we broke up, or rather, when she broke up with me, I'll admit it, her away messages often wrote how she was scared and didn't want to hear any noises. So I guess the activity in the home increased when I left. Again, not sure why. So, I want to find out more about the home, but I don't know where to start. I've been lurking on here for about 2 years now, and well, I decided to finally post about my experiences with ghosts. Really only one ghost. It happened to be here in my house for a number of years throughout the 70s. The house had been built in 1970 on an old lot where an old man had lived on a shack and had died. Now, The spirit that had stayed on the property was one of a child, though. Maybe the old man had a kid and it died. Who knows? Anyway, all sorts of stuff that one would imagine a child would do happened. You know, things would get lost, stuff would move from one place to another, vases and sculptures would be on their place on tables, and when the family would come back, the sad items would be in pieces, smashed against a wall about 3 or 4 feet away. Sometimes, of course, you couldn't get into the house because the screen door would be locked and nobody was in the house at the time. Just imagine a door with a simple hook going into the circle slot. Now, over the years, I've tried to get that hook to slip over into the lock, you know, to see if it could happen by accident. It could never be an accident. If one wants to lock that screen door, you intentionally do it. Feelings of being watched and feeling the weight of someone or something next to you in the bed. My grandma would tell me that I would go off in the house in my walker, circa 1981 or 82, and I would travel all the way from the kitchen to the living room to the hallway. Now, when one enters the hallway, even in the daytime, if all the doors to the room are shut, it is pitch black. She claimed that I would be in the hallway for a couple of minutes, and then I would come shooting out from the hallway as if my walker was pushed or shoved by something, all the way back to the kitchen and crash into the wall. Now, it would take me a couple of minutes to get all the way to the hallway since I was a toddler, yet it wouldn't even take me a minute to come crashing into the wall of the kitchen. Now, I remember seeing some sort of whitish gray ball floating when I was laying down on the rug one day. This must have been 1982 or 83. I can still see that image in my brain to this day. My grandmother noticed me getting up and looking under the dining room table, and I started to shout, "Get out!" or in my way of talking back then, "Get out!" My grandma started yelling, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" I kept on shouting and punching and kicking at nothing, all the way towards the front doorway. And when I got to the door, I kept kicking the door, and then I stopped. By this time, my grandmother, who was rather slow due to weight, had gotten to the hallway that led to the front door and was asking me what was wrong. She told me that I had said that I didn't want it here, and I told it to get out. I think I had some sort of hold over it, as I was the only child born in the house. My uncle, who was only 12 at the time, had been born in an older house. I think the spirit was attracted by the fresh new life that was now in the home, much like the spirits in Poltergeists were attracted to the little girl. You know, they wanted some sort of that life force. I think that was the case with this. I got rid of it before it got too powerful, much later on. What do you think? I've lived in this house for the past 27 years. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened since those early years. Ever since I was a little girl, I've seen things or felt things. I haven't decided if I follow the feelings and spirits, or if they follow me. When I was 7, I lived in a huge farmhouse. I was awakened one night by a cold feeling on my cheek, almost like someone was placing their hand and just brushing it against my cheek. I sat up in bed and looked around, expecting it to be my sister trying to wake me up. Instead, I was greeted with an empty room. I tried to fall asleep all night and couldn't. For weeks, I refused to sleep on my own room and stayed with my parents. About a month later, I was back to sleeping in my room and was awakened again, but this time by the closing of the side door downstairs. I thought it was my father coming home late, so I walked into the hallway. What greeted me on the stairs still scares the daylights out of me today. When I got to the stairs, a lady that I had never seen before was walking up the stairs, or so I thought. But when I looked closer, I realized that the woman was floating up the stairs. She wore a dark brown skirt and a white blouse covered by a jacket. The white blouse had been stained and red in a few places. When I squinted my eyes to try and get a better look at the blurred image, I saw that the woman's face was battered and covered in blood. I was frozen in my tracks and unable to move. I just stood there. She didn't appear for too long until she ultimately faded away, but I'm convinced that the presence was a former owner of the farmhouse I used to live in. In my last antidote, I introduce you to my mother's family, the Sorensens, who lived in East London, South Africa, during the first half of this century. In fact, most of the family members remaining alive at this time are still living in East London, although a few have also moved to other cities in the country. Families were, in those days, much larger than they are nowadays, and my mother's family, which had 12 children, was not unusual. This story concerns one of my mother's brothers, Nigel, who was, for some reason, nicknamed Boy. I've always known this story for as long as I can remember, but 2 weeks ago, I formally interviewed my mother. Before I start the story proper, let me give you just a little background on my family. My maternal grandmother's name was Mina, but I was, however, never fortunate enough to meet her, as she died some years before I was born. She and my maternal grandfather, Chris, did, however, instill in all their sons and daughters a deep and abiding belief of all things spiritual and religious, and the whole family were staunch Catholics. My mother and her brothers and sisters believe in ghosts and spirits, and, in my mother's own words, firmly believe that spirits of those people that we are close to in life remain close to us after their deaths. It was not uncommon, in the days of the beginning of this century, for an above average number of babies to die when very young. In my mother's family, however, only the firstborn, a boy called Ivan, died in early childhood, and the remaining 11 were all healthy and thrived, until 1944, that is. My Uncle Boy, who was 30 years old at the time, came on one night after having a few beers, and, as he did not want his mother to smell the alcohol on his breath, he decided to spend what remained of the night in his car that was parked outside their family house in Park Street. He did not have a peaceful night, however, as he was unfortunately brutally attacked and robbed. His attacker had on a pair of army boots and forcefully kicked my uncle on the head, so forcefully in fact that the boy later contracted and died from inflammation of the brain. He died in a hospital on July 2nd, 1944, and was buried by the family near the end of the month. The entire family was devastated, as he had been much loved. He had been the joker of the family, and always used to perform practical jokes on my mother and her older sisters, dressing up as Dracula and jumping out to frighten them and so on. He apparently had a very loving nature and a great sense of family, but had never married. On the day of the funeral, my grandmother, my mother and her sisters Lily, Janetta, and Edna locked up the house in Park Street and prepared to walk to the church, which was just down the street. They had recently received a large arrangement of St. Joseph lilies from a family friend, in sympathy for Boy's death, and the flowers had been placed in a vase in the dining room before the ladies had left for church. No one was left in the house, and, furthermore, no one, other than my grandmother, had keys to the house. After the service was finished, they walked back to their house and my grandmother unlocked the front door. The dogs were very excited to see them, most probably wanting company after having been left alone for so long. My mother, being the youngest, rushed past the others and into the dining room. She stopped dead in the dining room doorway and turned around. That's when she noticed the apparition of a boy standing right there. He had a completely blank expression and simply just pointed in the corner of the dining room. That's when my mother looked to see what he was pointing at and was horrified. She saw what appeared to be a dark figure with robes on and a hood, sitting on a rocking chair. A second later, boy disappeared, and so did the mysterious hooded figure. The most interesting part of this whole story is my mom told me that the chair was still rocking by itself moments after the hooded figure disappeared. I know this all sounds a little hard to believe, but believe me, this was a real occurrence. Believe it or not, ghosts and spirits do exist. You just have to be open to seeing them. Oh, and by the way, those lilies that you saw earlier in the story, the ones I mentioned, yes, they were face down where the apparitions were, 2 of them. I worked in a movie theater that used to be a theater before, but not movie, but stage. As a matter of fact, the stage is still there, complete with all the vents, dressing rooms, and the overhead mechanisms to control curtains. It was a very happening place during its time. There was a dining place called the Kit Kat next door to the theater, and a hotel on the other side. When the stage was closed, the place became a movie theater with 1 screen. It is still set up as a theater would have been in the area of segregation. It became a 2-screen movie theater recently, and the balcony has been closed off. There have been some pretty weird things going on upstairs. I was talking to the manager one night about something that happened as I was leaving pretty late. It sounded like something upstairs in the old lobby fell. Something big. I went up with a friend to check it out, but nothing could have fallen. After I'd gotten about half of my story out, the manager finished the story for me. He said that he experienced the same thing. We've both heard voices upstairs and footsteps on carpeted floors. No one ever really experienced anything, or they don't talk about it. Up until a few months ago, no one ever saw anybody. Well, that all stopped pretty recently. I have seen 2 men. I'm the only one who has seen anything. One of them was a shadow person. He was a very dark presence, so dark in fact that he almost appeared to be a cloud floating around the room. In fact, that's what he had been doing when I saw him. By the way, you could still make out the outline of this figure. He was also wearing a top hat. The presence that I saw was upstairs in the balcony. The feeling I got off of him ranks up there with the feeling I got the one time I encountered the shadow person. This guy, however, looked like he was some sort of construction worker. The manager, which is my uncle, has been doing a little bit of research and has come up with very little information. I've written a narrative about the man upstairs. My fiance drew a picture of him without my knowledge, just from the description I had given him. I saw the picture one day in the backseat of his car, and it sent chills through my body. The city is wanting to tear down this building and put an even larger theater in its place. We do not know how long the owner of the building is going to hold out on selling it. Hi, I'm not sure if this is a ghost story, or just me being nervous because of old fables, but I'll share it with you anyway, and I'm anxious to hear what you think. First of all, I'm from South Louisiana, where ghosts, voodoo, and haunted antebellum homes are a way of life, or at least a big part of the history down there. About 3 miles from my parents' home, where I grew up, there's an old plantation house, which I believe was built in the 1800s. I know that I'm going to skip around, because I feel like I have to explain everything, but please bear with me. While I was growing up, I always felt scared to be outside, or even alone in my parents' house, but I don't think the house itself was haunted, but maybe the area, because it was so close to this old house. I actually never even noticed the house until like only 6 or 7 years ago, when someone finally bought it and decided to refurbish it. The house was once known as the Stephanie Plantation, then as the Halfin House, and I believe that there was also one more name for it, but I can't think of it right now. The new owner put a lot of effort into doing research into the history of the house and how it looked, pretty much to find out anything and everything about it. First of all, he was a friend of my father, so we got to see the house through many stages of its rebirth. The new owner took before and after photos of the house. The before photos really scared me. There were, I believe, 5 faces or bodies of ghosts in the pictures, but they were very clear. One looked like a man, maybe with a beard and very proper demeanor. Another was a lady in the ball gown. That was what the silhouette looked like, and possibly a crown. Another looked like a small child looking out of the window, and another just a blur. One looked like a man screaming, and it seemed to have chains on his wrists. I don't know what exactly to say about these pictures, but I know what I saw, and I know how the house felt, and I believe them. I've always felt a type of sixth sense, if you want to call it that. My dreams often come true. ESP is a frequent thing for me, and I always get these feelings. I'm not trying to say I'm psychic, because I'm not sure exactly what this is, but I have come to try to use them more and more. Anyway, the house was very cold, even though it was the dead of summer, probably 100 degrees and humid. The typical South. Anyway, it had this very eerie and unwelcoming and not very peaceful feeling to it. And as weird as it may seem, I kept getting like these glimpses or flashbacks that were very dark, but they were of this house. The new owner had tons of stories of hauntings by him and previous visitors, or just stories that were documented. I talked to this friend of my mother-in-law who is really into this stuff, and she seems to think that for some reason I have a connection with this house, that it isn't just me being a channel. I don't know what to think. I don't really want to know. Every time I visited this house, I would get the creeps, and always in the same places. There was a small closet-looking space at the top, 3rd floor, which was recorded to have been used as an infirmary in the war. I was standing near it, thinking. I was getting a funny feeling about it, and didn't notice my brother behind me. As a joke, he picked me up and pushed me inside of it, and I'll never forget the black flash, if that makes sense, that came to me. I'm not sure if I actually saw it, or just remembered it, but it was one of the single most frightening events to date. It was like I could hear, just for that brief second, screaming and cries, and see so many people in that small space. I don't know, I guess I can't really explain it. Anyway, the room that was supposed to be the infirmary still has bloodstains on the floor, even though the original boards have been removed and replaced. I truly think something more happened up there. So then all of a sudden, this guy and his wife up and sold the house to my father's cousin, Curtis. He got a grant from the state to do further research on the house, and he actually tracked down many original pieces from the house. In the meantime of all of this, I get engaged, and one day, I woke up, and something told me that I should have my wedding pictures taken in the old Halfin house. So I called him up, and asked if that would be okay. He was reluctant, because he really didn't want any more pictures taken, and of the house, but finally agreed. So I went back, because I was so totally drawn to this house. Since Curtis has been restoring this house, there's a much more peaceful air in it, really. And anyway, as I was walking around, I prepared myself to be more open to anything. I walked in the ballroom and got this very clear vision of this lady with a beautiful gown and crown on. maybe the lady in the picture. And even though I already had my wedding dress picked out, I immediately went home and asked my mother to make the dress exactly as I told her. And she did, though she found it was very hard to understand me sometimes. Anyway, the dress turned out beautiful and exactly as I had envisioned it. And of course, I topped it off with a small crown. I went and took the pictures, and when I walked out of the room, dressed that way, I felt the most wonderful, peaceful, and almost happy vibe rush in and out of me. It was like just me looking that way brought peace to the house. The pictures went well, but there are a couple questionable ones which I want to send to you to examine when I received them back from my mother. They were taken on a dead tree, but where we believe someone, or more than one, was hung to death. In the tops of the trees there is a mist. I thought it was the sun, but some say no. I would just like to see what you think. Anyway, to thank Curtis, I sent him a blow-up picture of the entire exterior of the house, with me standing on the balcony of the master room. He later came to tell my father that he can't explain it, but since that day, there has been a great peaceful feeling in the house. I'm anxious to hear what you think, and then again about the pictures. I hope I have not wasted too much of your time. Thank you. I've had several ghost experiences, but the one I'm writing happened when I was about 16. We lived in a very rural area, in a big tri-level house. The bedrooms and a bathroom were on the top floor, a small bedroom, a bathroom, the kitchen, and a huge living and dining room were on the second, and the bottom floor was a 2-door garage. The master bedroom on the top floor had once its own deck, and still had the sliding door, which now leads to a 16-foot drop to the backyard. It is important to know this, because we often would hear someone knocking on that door, even when we had the blinds open, and could see there wasn't anyone there. The stairs from the second floor to the third went straight halfway to a landing, then turned right, and went up the rest of the way. On the landing on your left, if you were going upstairs, was a picture window. I was standing at the top of the stairs one afternoon, calling my 2 younger brothers. The youngest, Lee, came to the bottom of the stairs and asked what I wanted. He and Chris were getting a snack. I was going to answer him when I felt a hard shove against my shoulders. I fell down the stairs to the landing. My brother raced up the stairs to the landing, calling our other brother. I stood up with Lee's help. Since I was okay, I shrugged it off as an accident and forgot. Weeks later, my brother was in the house by himself. He was coming downstairs. I could see him through the window, and he tumbled down the stairs to the landing. He swore someone pushed him, but he and I were the only ones home, and he had been the only one inside. The next day, stupid kids that we were, we decided to test it. Lee stood at the bottom of the stairs, Chris stood outside and watched through the window, and I, really stupid, okay, stood at the top. I felt something push me, and I started to fall again. I caught myself on the rail and was standing. Something I couldn't see was trying to pull my hands off the rail. I got up and ran down the stairs in record time. Chris said he couldn't see anything, but Lee swore he saw a shadow chase me from the landing down to the second floor. After that, none of us would go down the stairs alone, and we always ran. For some reason, they wouldn't tell our parents decided to move, only 6 months after we started living in the house. I live in a small town in Kansas. I've lived in several houses in this town, and in just about each house have had strange experiences. The first I can recall was in a small farmhouse in the country. My sister and I shared a room and had bunk beds. The head of the bed was the opposite of how most people would set a room up. The head of the bed was by the window, and the foot of the bed was flush to the wall. I was in the bottom bunk, and my sister on the top bunk. I recall waking up one night and looking out the window to the shed that was across from me. In the top window, the second floor, I noticed a black human figure, no discernible facial features. It had a pale yellow light glowing around it, just purely out of fear and not wanting to experience this alone. I asked my sister, who was supposedly asleep on the top bunk, if she was seeing what I was seeing, not expecting to hear her to really answer me, and she said yes. We still joke about our psychic connection. When I was in high school and living in a small town as I do, my friends and I would drive around the countryside, mostly because we heard that there was some scary haunted place outside of town, and we always liked to investigate. But one night, I was sitting in the front seat of my friend's car and noticed that there was a small boy running in the road ahead of us. It was rather late at night, at least sometime after midnight, a very strange hour for young boys to be running out in the country. I noticed that he had on a red and green striped shirt and brown pants. What was really creepy, though, was the way he just kept looking back at us, almost begging to be hit. I could only see this boy at the middle point of the curve in the road. Just as we were rounding the last corner, he would disappear. It would only last several seconds. I questioned whether or not I was losing my mind, or if I really saw it, because no one else did. Another story I have was when I bought the house I live in now, still the same town. I'd fallen asleep on the floor in my living room. My dog was sleeping next to me. I'm not even sure what exactly woke me up, but when I looked towards my bedroom, I could see a small girl in a white nightgown. She had blonde hair, and next to her was a white cat. I could see through them. They had a mist around them. And again, just as it registered what I was seeing, they vanished. A few months later, I was in my room, standing on the edge of my bed, which is right next to the bedroom door. I was reaching for the light fixture to change the light bulb, with my arms extended. I noticed a man, dark short hair, and in his 30s. He had dark-rimmed glasses, and he walked past me through the living room, into my room. As soon as he got past my arm, so he would be standing right in front of me, he disappeared. I've also noticed small dark figures, a possible dog, like roaming around me when I was walking in my house at night. I always try to jump over them, thinking that it was my dog, but she was in another room when this happened. In 1978, my parents purchased a relatively new house in Niceville, Florida. The land the house had been built on had previously been a swamp that was drained to make way for the housing subdivision. Nothing bad had ever happened in the house, yet, after living in the house for a short time, we all began to notice odd things. It started the night I broke up with my fiance. My parents had got out for the evening, and I was in my bedroom crying. Suddenly, I realized I was not alone. I looked up, and I saw a woman dressed in the turn-of-the-century clothing. She had a look of extreme empathy on her face. I did a double take. Never take your eyes off of them, I've learned. And my visitor was gone. My brother brought her engagement ring into my room so that I could take it to work the next day and have it sized. When I woke up from my nap, I got the ring off the dresser and noticed that it wasn't quite right. I got on my loupe and discovered that the ring had been squashed. I took the ring to my parents and showed it to them. Dad examined the ring. As a scientist, he was a little more observant than I was. He pointed out that the ring appeared to have been squashed from the right, beside the head that held the diamond, as if it had been sitting on the rear shank of the ring, and an incredible force put on it that literally broke the head from the shank, without leaving a single scratch or gouge mark. That kind of spooked me, since I had been sleeping with the ring on the nightstand next to my head, and it had been fine prior to being placed by my bed. However, events would soon unfold that made us all realize that the house was indeed haunted by the lady, but she was a friendly ghost, provided you were nice to her family. After having moved to the house, my mom was in a terrible car accident, which almost killed her. She was in the hospital for over 6 weeks, and even after she got out, she was in and out of the hospital repeatedly. By this time, I was married and out of the house, but my middle sister's kids would stay over while my sister worked nights. My niece slept in my old room, which seemed to soon become the epicenter for activity, perhaps because of the pre-adolescent age. It started with her being awakened by the feeling that someone was sitting on the bed. She turned on the light and saw depression in the bed, as if someone were sitting there. As she watched, the depression slowly lifted out, as if the person sitting there had stood up. She was too frightened to sleep in the room after that, so her brother slept there for her. He was awakened every night by the sound of a dresser drawer being pulled out and rattled. At first he thought it was Granny, but then he turned the light on and there was no one there. The final straw for my sister's kids came when they were sleeping over one night. Mom had just been released from the hospital, yet again, and was sitting up in the den. Dad had gone to bed. Suddenly, Dad was awakened by the sound of the smoke alarms going off. He ran into the den and found Mom passed out. She had been in incredible pain since her accident and had begun stashing pills for a grand escape. That night, she had gotten so depressed that she ended up taking all the pills that she had been hoarding. There was no evidence of smoke in the house, not even Mom's usual cigarette smoke. By this time, the smoke alarms had stopped blaring their alarms, but Dad stood there, surveying the scene and thinking about how much pain Mom was in and how horrible her life had been since the accident, and even going as far as to whether it was even right for him to decide that Mom was not entitled to escape the horror her life had become. Then the smoke alarms went off again. Dad figured somebody was trying to tell him something, and he called 911. The next day, after we had all been to the hospital to make sure that Mom was going to be okay, we all gathered at my parents' house. I asked Dad why he had called the paramedics. I felt like the doctors who had saved my mom's life after the accident had not taken into consideration the lack of quality of life she would have, and I felt like Mom was entitled to a reprieve from the constant torment she was in. Dad looked at me kind of funny and explained about the smoke detectors. Then he said that when he had gotten home later that night, he had torn each of the smoke detectors apart, and there was nothing wrong with any of them, nor was there any reason they should have gone off in the first place. Once Dad told us this, We all sat there with odd looks on our faces and started talking about the lady. By this time, I'd seen her twice. My older sister had seen her once, and my skeptical scientist dad even admitted to having seen her. We began comparing notes and found us finishing each other's stories and descriptions. We had all seen the same lady dressed in the same clothing, and none of us had mentioned it to the others for fear of being ridiculed. As time went by, the lady continued to watch over her family. After my dad's death in 1998, my then husband and I were in the den of the house after we had cleaned out the possessions and cleaned the house up. I'd left a book on the counter, and X went back to get it. Our marriage was on the rocks, and he was becoming increasingly abusive to me. Something that the lady didn't seem to care for. He had always laughed at our family ghost stories, up till the day. But when he went back in the house to get my book, he came out of the house shaking and white. He had felt a cold hand brush across his face. Then, when he didn't leave fast enough, he felt the same cold hand pushing him in the back, propelling him to the door. The lady was trying to tell him that she did not appreciate the way she was treating one of her kids, nor was he welcome in her home. After that, the lady began dropping by my house. I always knew she was around because the stove timer would go off for no reason and the dresser drawers would rattle. After I left the abusive hubby and moved to the Midwest, the lady would come by and visit me there from time to time, always setting off the timer on the stove, rattling drawers, playing tricks with the blinds, anything she could do to let me know she was keeping an eye out for me. I realized that this is unusual for ghosts to leave their primary residence and to actually follow people from home to home, but I talked to some friends who all felt like the lady was probably a female ancestor who had died in childbirth, so she felt responsible for looking out for her family. After going through the family archives, we found a photo of my great-grandmother. She had died of appendicitis when she was pregnant. The baby also died. The woman in the photo looked like the lady. My sister is now living in the house. When she first moved in, she put some pots in the cabinet, then went to the bathroom for a minute. When she came back out, the pots were sitting on the floor. Earrings and rings that had been lost for years, some in different houses that we lived in, suddenly appeared on the cabinet or in my sister's jewelry box. Unseen hands frequently pull back the curtains to look outside, and my sister's dog loves to romp and play with the unseen visitor. I could go on and on about all the poltergeist activity, some that seemed to be coming from the lady, others that seemed to be coming from my deceased dad. From fax machines that go off when they aren't plugged in, my deceased dad's voice calling me to wake me up when the gas fireplace developed a leak, even luggage being set on its end. Weird stuff just follows my sister and I around. Just 2 nights ago, while laying in bed, I was awakened by the bed shaking. I sat up and looked around and found my husband sound asleep and the door securely closed against kitty visitors. I laid back down and snuggled up to my hubby, thinking that he just had a chronic jerk that shook the bed when it suddenly hit again. The whole bed kind of went womp, as if a 20-pound weight had been dropped on it. This time, I knew that there were no cats in the room, and since I'd been snuggled up to my hubby,
I knew he had not jerked in his sleep. It's nice having your own guardian spirit to watch over you, but it can really interfere with your sleeping. I know that some people think that we're all nuts, or engaging in what shrinks call magical thinking, but every time I start to question my own sanity, I get another visit. It should be interesting when we move to my dad's hometown this spring. I imagine the visits will become a regular thing. Growing up in rural northern Wisconsin, there were few opportunities for earning cash, aside from service positions and agricultural work. Coming from a farm family myself, as a youth, I would hire myself out to farmers to help with the work on their respective farms, mostly crops and dairy cattle. If you never have this experience, it may come as a surprise that these farms are usually isolated and could be quite unfriendly, creepy, and sometimes dangerous. Physical injuries like losing an eye or a limb or even a life are not uncommon. This is the setting for my story. One January, I was a hired boy at a dairy farm owned by an elderly couple with whom I was acquainted with through a parish church. The farmer's house was heated by a wood furnace in the basement, where I was lodged, and among my other jobs, I had to bring in the wood and tend the fire. One day, while carrying wood down the steps, I felt pushed, which caused me to slip and fall down the stairs, landing on the concrete floor, which knocked me out temporarily. I must have been out only a minute or two, as I awoke in pain and found the wood scattered all over. The farmer was very stern, and I feared how he would react to a mess and me not being busy with the work to which I had been assigned. When he did see me, he asked where I'd been and what I had been doing, and so I explained it to him. As I suspected, he was cross with me. Later that night, over supper, he told me a story which made me rethink my staying there. He related that some time ago, his wife, although a Catholic like me, had been dabbling in the occult, things like divination, astrology, cards, etc. Odd things began happening around the farm, and it was no longer prospering. He told me that the last straw had been when he awoke to find her levitating above their bed in the middle of the night. They decided to call the parish priest. The priest, whom I will call Father X in the story, was a mature, spiritual, and virtuous man whom I knew and respected. His brother was likewise a priest and an exorcist. The couple explained what was happening on their farm and house. Father X had to get rid of the occult books and the paraphernalia, and after hearing their confession and absolving them, offered to bless and cleanse the house with a kind of minor exorcism. Before getting out his handbook of rituals and his stolen holy water, he had them close and lock the doors and windows for some reason. He went through the residence, leading the couple in prayers and reciting the house blessing and minor prayers of exorcism, all the while sprinkling each room with holy water. When they reached the last room, which was the kitchen, Father X was finishing the prayers, and after everyone said amen, the kitchen door, which led outside, unlocked by itself, opened and then slammed shut. Father X then explained that this is why he had locked the doors previously, to make sure that by the door opening and closing by invisible force, he could tell by that sign that the spirit had really left. The farmer went on to explain that he liked the instruction that Father X had left him with.
namely, that the devil is like a dog on a leash. The demons are all restrained by the power of God, he said, chained, as it were, and they cannot really hurt you directly unless you come within their reach. Occult practices, blasphemies, and even grave sins can put people in places within the perimeter of the influence of evil spirits, and so if you want to avoid being harmed by them, don't come near them any more than you would approach a vicious dog that has been chained. I asked the farmer if the basement where I was lodging was also blessed. The farmer thought for a moment and said he did not recall that it was. The door to the basement was right outside of the kitchen door. After the experience with my fall that day, and the story that the farmer told me about what had transpired, I determined that I would not stay there another week. I left and didn't return. I didn't explain why, except to say that I wanted to be closer to the parish church and I wanted to go to daily mass. I did not have my own transportation at that time, except my bicycle. The farmer was unhappy that I left, as I was hardworking and well behaved, but for me, there were plenty of other farms where I could work that did not have such problems. Throughout my life, I'd seen and experienced a few things that I can only describe as supernatural. Everything I'm about to tell you about actually happened, and I'll describe each experience as I remember them. The first thing I can remember happened whenever I was only a young boy, growing up outside a village in Northern Ireland called Besbrook. It was during the winter because we had a heavy snowfall the previous night, and I was outside playing with my two brothers. After a while, I went inside to warm up because my hands were frozen. My mother told me to take off my boots so that I wouldn't tramp snow all over the house. I sat down at the table with a bowl of soup in front of me, and it was then that I noticed something out of the corner of my eye in the hall leading from the kitchen to the living room. I turned to see what it was, and what I saw absolutely terrified me. I saw the figure of a woman walking down the hall towards the kitchen. I just got up and ran out the door without putting on my boots and jacket into the snow, and refused to come back inside, even though my mother insisted that there was no woman in the house. Over the next number of years, nothing happened except what sounded like somebody walking around the house, even when the rest of the household was in bed or away. Everyone heard the noises, but chose to ignore them. Then one Saturday morning while I was still in bed, I was shook and awake and told to get up and come down to breakfast. Whenever I opened my eyes, there was no one in the room, so I assumed that they had already gone downstairs. While I was getting dressed, a voice was calling from downstairs for me to hurry up. When I did get down to the kitchen, there was no one around. Everyone else was still in bed. A few days after, my youngest brother claims to have saw a young boy standing in my parents' bedroom who just stood there looking at him. Shortly after this, someone unknown attacked my brother in his bed, leaving him with a black eye. The next few years were quiet, except for the noises. Nothing else that I know of has happened in that house, except for the noises. But I did tell you that I lived outside a village. The best way to get to the village is through a wooded area, and this place is a very strange place. I could distinctly remembering a moment when I had to walk through these woods to get to the village, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, I saw a circle of people in white robes
just standing in a circle and holding hands. I was so scared about what was happening that I ran the other direction and no longer wanted to run through those woods ever again. I actually had a friend of mine who was walking through the woods, and he swears to this day that he saw a woman just flying from the distance from one side to the other. Looked like a witch, but she was floating, had really dark black hair, and it just looked like she faded out. These are the only things I've seen in my life, and with that last story, my friend has seen, but I've heard other stories by people I know. The shop at the bottom of the road is said to be haunted by the ghosts of the 7 British people killed there in the 80s, whenever the original patrol station was blown up. I mentioned earlier, I'm from Northern Ireland. There is a high viaduct in the area, which is used as a railway line. 18 people died constructing it, 1 for each arch, and numerous others have offed themselves off of it. The stories are that at times, you can see these people, and they all look sad. There's also the blood on one wall in a friend's house, and no matter how many times it is painted over, the blood still comes through. All this is true, and has happened within a square mile of where I live. My friend from Arizona and I made our first trip to the Queen Mary together. We happened to run into a paranormal researcher when we were on a tour and decided to stay the night. We rented a room with 2 beds so the researcher could stay with us and show us around the old boat in the middle of the night when the most activity had been reported. We attempted to fall asleep around 11 p.m. I managed to sleep quite easily and wasn't scared about sleeping in one of the reported haunted rooms. About 5 minutes after I fell asleep, my friend wakes me up. The first thing I remember was hearing a staticky voice and thought it was a radio. It wasn't until she asked me if I heard the voice. That was when I realized there was no radio anywhere in my room. My instant reaction was to turn on the light and look around the room. I reached up and tried turning on the light, and nothing happened. We were really freaking out now. The light had just been on. My friend finally turned her light on, and we laid there in bed for a few more minutes, and I decided to try the light again, and this time it turned on no problem. We tried to fall asleep again because we wanted to wander around the ship at 3 a.m. to avoid security guards. As soon as we turned off the lights and laid down, I saw my blanket pushed down and felt something on my arm. My friend also reported feeling things brush against her arm. As tired as we were, we just decided to ignore it all and go to sleep. 3 o'clock rolled around and we went to the pool room, reported to be the most paranormally active area on board. We took several pictures, and the researcher and my friend called out to the known ghosts. I didn't want to because I really felt like I was intruding. I felt sad and angry feelings throughout the whole area. I was looking around when we all heard a man moaning. My friend and I booked it back up the stairs and stood against the wall. After a few minutes, we joined the researcher again, and he continued to call out to a little girl named Jackie. I wasn't paying attention at the time, but I heard my friend gasp, and I looked over, and she asked me if I heard that. I missed it. The researcher heard it too. It was the voice of the little girl. She was singing for them. I will never forget my experiences at the Queen Mary.
and actually plan on going back soon. I came aboard not believing and left a member of a paranormal research group. Well, about 14 years ago, I left my partner. I was looking for somewhere out in the country so I could get away from people I knew. So, I rented an old converted Methodist chapel. No one had lived in it before, and it was set in some lovely countryside, surrounded by hills, about 24 miles away from where I live now. It took me a day to clean the place, as it had not long been converted into a living space, and there was lots of plaster dust and wood shavings everywhere. It was all open plan with the chapel windows at one side, converted into arches, leading to a wonderful new conservatory, which was the length of the chapel. I fell in love with it, as did everyone the first time they had visited. It also has a built-on back, which was the toilet, bath, and shower room. My bedroom was the gallery, and a new gallery had been put on the side, which became my daughter's bedroom, and the vestry type of room by the door became my son's bedroom. The landlord had left the pulpit in, and had used the benches and pews as sort of shelf seats around the walls. Everyone who visited me thought I had won the polls. It was before the lottery. I loved it. The front door was oak, and the original door of the chapel, the back door, was by the bathroom and was an addition to the property. I did not believe in all that rubbish about ghosts and things. Well, to begin with, when things started happening, I thought maybe I was hearing things, as I was very depressed. Within a month, I thought I was having some sort of crazy breakdown, but I didn't understand why I was okay at work. I just heard things, strange noises, in the chapel, like men mumbling, and footsteps like a small child. I'm worried about going on, as people will think I'm crazy. Well, as I said, I kept hearing things, and then things like the cooker clock kept pinging at strange hours. Then I would go to bed and hear a child running down in the living area. These were regular occurrences. I was on call some evenings and some days. I worked for a helpline, and we took the calls in our homes, sometimes redirected from the office, and I'd begun to realize that these noises were happening mostly at either 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. I still thought I was going insane, so I did not tell anyone. I kept sending the kids to visit their father at weekends, as I was worried about my mental health. Then, the atmosphere changed, and I felt there were people in there with me. I would get up in the morning and find my children's toys on the floor, or the pots and pans on the floor. By now I was really frantic. I didn't know if I was doing it, and if I should go to the doctor. Nothing happened when my friends stayed. I began to get seriously scared for my mental health. More and more was happening at weekends, and I was frightened to go to sleep. And when I did, I thought my bed was shaking, as if someone was trying to wake me up. Then I started inviting friends to stay, just so I was not alone. I would make lovely meals and get a bottle of wine and invite people to stay over, as once they had a drink, I knew that they could not drive home. I regularly invited people to stay on the weekends. One weekend, while we were all sitting down to eat at 3 p.m., there were the four of us. We heard what sounded like a child running up the stairs. My friend David jumped up and said, "Someone is in here." I was that used to hearing the noises, and I was strangely embarrassed. You would think I would be glad someone else could hear it. I made a feeble excuse, but he went on to search the home. After we had drunk a couple of bottles of wine, I began to tell him about the noises. I did not tell him about the toys and stuff, and they all made fun of me. And we all decided it was silly, and we carried on having a drink. One of the other guys then began being silly in the pulpit and calling on imaginary ghosts. Everyone was laughing, including me, as by now, they had me believing loneliness had led me to imagine all sorts. Then, after lots of laughing, we all decided to settle down for the night, as the chapel was open plan. Nobody really got undressed, and we had a lot to drink. We were all laughing from the beds, and we ended up saying goodnight to each other, shouting things like "Goodnight, John Boy," "Goodnight, Mary Ellen," and giggling and saying it all over again. When the front door opened, it was made of oak and over 100 years old and was extremely heavy. Even the wind couldn't have blown it open. Lee got up and closed it, and we all began laughing again. After the initial fright, we started the "Goodnight, Sleep Tight, John Boy" thing again, and the back door opened. Well, this was a new door which was always stiff to open and close, and the smell of strawberries was incredibly strong. I had smelled this many times before in the chapel, but thought it was bubble bath or something my daughter was using. Lee got up again and asked if someone was playing tricks on us. We were out in the country, and the nearest neighbor was 10 minutes walking away. My landlord. I said it probably was. So we all got up to have a cup of coffee. It was just past 3 in the morning when the back door and front door started banging open and closed over and over again. It felt like forever, but it was probably only about 6 times. No one moved. No one spoke. When it stopped, no one mentioned it. David just went out. We found out later he went out to see if anyone was in the lane. We did not even question where he had gone, and I had just made more coffee for everyone. We all sat there when David returned. We began to talk about how late it was, as if nothing had happened. I cannot explain how surreal it was, and then the lights began to flicker. I started mumbling about earth tremors, as if we got lots of them in Wales. All my friends were from the Midlands. And power cuts, when the car started up outside. I'm really not joking here. My friends all ran out, and all the windows were open on the car, and it was ticking over, with no key in the ignition. They were all convinced someone was playing silly tricks on us, and David and Lee sat in the car until dawn to try and catch anyone that might be out there. Nothing else happened, so at breakfast, we all laughed about how some country person had decided to give us a fright. The lads never visited me again, and everyone went home much, much earlier than they had planned. When they had all gone, the phone kept pinging, as if it was about to ring, so I really thought maybe some bad weather was on its way. Later in the afternoon, I kept feeling like someone was watching me, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. More and more, I was encouraging my friend Jane to stay over. I began to hate being alone. One afternoon, while the children were still at school, I was telling Jane about some of the strange things, and a picture flew off the side. It made us jump, and we laughed and put it back. It flew off again, as if someone had pushed it. Again, silence. We did not say anything. Then, we heard scratching beneath the floor. We found out later that the landlord's cat had recently had kittens, so I still believe it was one of them. But we freaked out and rolled back the carpet and found a trap door and a Welsh Bible with children's writing in it. We put it back, and then the dormer windows and the roof began to shake as if they were going to come down on us. We ran out of the house and went into town to meet the kids. Nothing happened then for a few weeks, which was really unusual, as by now, things were happening on a daily basis. Sometime later, and by now, I was looking for a property in the nearby town. It was the summer holidays, so I sent my kids off again, as they had never mentioned anything. I believe that it was only happening when they were asleep or out of the house. I was sitting alone one evening and looked up and saw a sort of pale bluish mist on the ceiling, and then hundreds of flies started falling out of the woodwork. It took me 2 full days to vacuum them all up. Loads of things happened that summer, and the fly thing happened twice. The kids returned one evening. I had to attend a meeting, and I had took some of my work friends back to the chapel to feed my kids and let them know I would not be home until 8:30, and to make sure they were okay, and to remind them if they needed anything to call the landlord. We had an arrangement to check on the kids. There was a knock on the door. I answered it, and this young guy was there. He was really nice and asked how long I'd lived there, so I told him, just a few months, and he said, I used to go to Sunday school there. I would love to see inside. Can I come in? He went on to explain he was the farmer's son from down the hill at the dairy farm, and he was training to be a teacher in Shoebury. It was not home very often, and he was going back in the morning, so he would love to come in and take a peek, and he could not imagine anyone living there. As he was so nice, and I had a house full, I welcomed him in and showed him around. One of the women I had brought home with me were nearly drooling over him, and one in particular, Tina, was really doing her best to flirt. I showed him around, which did not take long, as it was open plan. He told me that where I'd converted to log burner, bottled gas, there used to be a roaring fire in the winter. He felt the pews along the walls and said I would have sat on one of those. I explained that he would have to go out soon, and he left asking if he could come again. He said he knew a lot of history about the place. Well, as I knew the farmer, and he seemed so nice, and Tina was by now making it so clear she was really interested, I said yes, and asked that, if he did come, he must let me know in advance. I was thinking he could tell his father to contact me. He left saying see you soon, and we all waved to him as he walked up the lane. Well, after that, Tina was just now going on and on about him. None of us could remember his name, and I promised to find out for her. For a few weeks, I could not get rid of Tina. She would come for any little reason and kept on at me to find out about him. Then something happened at her home, and Tina asked if she could stay with us. She stayed for a few weeks while I helped her find a flat, even though I was not doing very well finding a new place of my own. Tuesdays she would go to college, and often strange things would happen, but only on a Tuesday. But if I'm honest, I sort of got used to it, and did not mention anything anymore to anyone. Then, she moved into her new flat, and wow, the chapel went crazy. Every night strange noises, but now the child's footsteps had stopped, and it began to feel bad in there. Tina still kept on at me to find out more about the guy who had visited. She wanted a name, and hopefully a date. So one day I saw the farmer on his quad bike, and I waved him down. He was a real nice guy and had taken my children lambing earlier in the spring. Well, I asked him how his son was. He looked at me and said I don't have a son. So I explained. He looked at me as if I was a bit of an idiot. And then he went on to explain someone had played a trick on me. No one would have gone to Sunday school in the chapel for at least 55 years. So if the guy had been to Sunday school there, he would have to be, at the very least, 60. And as far as he knew, there was no teacher training college in Shrewsbury. I was so embarrassed, and as I walked home, I got angry. Maybe it was the same guy who was playing tricks on me making noises. Maybe he was even coming into the house while we were asleep. I walked into the home in a right temper, and I swear I heard a man laugh. My children suddenly got really cheeky and naughty, very different to how they were before. My daughter would not speak to me at all for 4 weeks. My son was angry all the time. I sent them away more and more at weekends. A small fire started one night by my bed. It went out. I started believing I was going mad again. I could hear men's voices mumbling. There was really an oppressive feeling in the home. Even a friend Steve said he felt uncomfortable in there and had loved visiting before. Jane stayed over more and more often, and now she was hearing things too. Now I knew it wasn't me. I'm not sure if I'm telling all of this in the correct order, but lots of things happened, but it felt bad. Not like the more innocent things previously, like pots and pans being moved and paying clocks. Things would be moved all the time. The smell of strawberries would float past you just before the door would fly open. My car started up on its own, outside on a few occasions. I took it to the garage. The mechanic thought I was nuts. I made him check the ignition. It got worse and worse. I was desperately trying to find a 3-bed house to rent in the town. Well, things kept going from bad to worse. My life was a mess. I was not getting proper sleep. My children had turned into horrible monsters, and things kept happening. I will not repeat it at all, because I would be here forever. But it ended one night, when I was sitting alone. I got a fear I still cannot explain, and I could not move from the chair. I knew I was heading for hysteria, so I phoned my friend Steve, who lived in the town. "Steve, I'm so scared. Will you come over?" The phone went dead. I sat there for about 15 minutes, the fear rising, and the air was freezing, and there was the blue mist on the ceiling again. Anyway, Steve walked in and started screaming and lifted me up, threw me in his car, and drove back into the town. When we got back to his house, I asked him why he screamed. We did not speak in the car. He told me he did not really know why, but he said when he walked in, he had a feeling that we would both die if we stayed in there. I slept in his room. I was too scared to be alone, and I think he was too. But I still have to laugh. Steve is 20-odd years younger than me. And the following morning, his parents looked like they were going to have a heart attack when they seen us both come down the stairs. We did explain. Well, sort of. It's hard to explain that sort of thing. I found a new home not long after. But that was not the end. The day I was leaving, a really old woman, she had to be around 80-ish, knocked on the window. I went out to see where she had come from. She had walked from the top of the hill way beyond the landlord's house and said, "I always meant to come down and meet you, so when I heard you were leaving, I thought I would come by and say goodbye." I thanked her and apologized that I could not even offer her a cup of tea, as all my things were packed. She smiled and said, "Don't worry." And as she was walking away, she looked back at me and said in a really spooky horror film type of way, "You were never lonely here, were you? They will miss you." A few weeks later, I was with lots of friends and their children, and Jane was there and was asking how I like my new home. And we were chatting away, and she said, "Bet you're glad to get away from those ghosts." And my daughter, who I thought was playing, but was actually behind me, piped up, "Did you see them too?" It turned out they had seen a young girl often in the mirror who smelled of strawberries, and that she was trying to warn them about a bad man who still lived there, who made all noises and banged the doors. They thought they were protecting me by not telling me this. Whether you believe me or not is up to you, and I'm wondering if I should even put it down in writing in case someone who knows me reads it. But my kids were back to normal, nice people, as soon as we moved into town, and they have since told me of all the things they heard. But they have seen stuff too that I never did. They thought it only happened when I was not in or asleep.
Back in the 1970s, I was living in Southampton, England, and working as a builder. It was a good time for me. I was earning enough money, had a good set of mates, and no family relying on me. I was young and free and enjoying life. My experience with the supernatural goes back to that time. I was on a building project in a village in a new forest called Lyndhurst, and we were working on extending an old hotel, the Lyndhurst Park Hotel. It had just had new owners, and they wanted to give it a revamp to go with its new home. I'd always known it as the Grand. Right from the start, something felt wrong. Whenever you went on site, you got the feeling that you weren't supposed to be there, like someone didn't want you there. You'd feel freezing cold, even though it was hot, sunny day. You'd forget things, get confused. A lot of the others said they saw a face watching them from a window in the empty hotel, but I never did see it myself. For me, it was mainly the feelings at first. The hotel is right on the high street, so it's in full view of whoever wants to look. Quite often, passerby would hang out and watch us work, and a lot of the locals would make a habit of it. I'd always known it as the Grand. Right from the start, something felt wrong. Whenever you went on site, you got the feeling that you weren't supposed to be there, like someone didn't want you there. You'd feel freezing cold, even though it was hot, and a sunny day. You'd forget things, get confused. A lot of the others said they saw a face watching them from a window in the empty hotel, but I never did see it myself. For me, it was mainly the feelings at first. The hotel is right on the high street, so it's in full view of whoever wants to look. Quite often, passerby would hang about and watch us work, and a lot of the locals would make a habit of it, a lot of them less than happy with the extension to the property. After a while, me and the rest began to notice a particular old man staring up at us watching, always on his own, and usually after the light had started to go. He was certainly memorable as his clothes were strange and very old-fashioned, almost like he was in a costume, but subtle. A few times we tried to go down to talk to him, but by the time we got there, he was already gone. Anyway, it was when I was checking on electronics in an older part of the hotel that I had the encounter. I was in a long corridor and saw a figure at the other end. When I called to him, I saw it was the old man, so I challenged him, saying he shouldn't be in here. "You should not be in here," he replied. "Come on, mate. Who are you and why are you here? I'm a builder. You have to go. I am Duke Stakepole, and you have to go." At this point, I tried to touch him, to urge him out. When I did, my whole arm went numb and ice cold. I got this sharp pain in my head, and everything started spinning. The man seemed to grow, and his eyes got bigger and bigger until they filled everything. I woke up to a couple of the other guys over me, asking if I was okay. It was an hour later, and I had a splitting headache. I got checked out by a doctor, but he couldn't explain it. When I eventually told some of the others about it, a couple of them told me about similar experiences they had, which I won't share, as they aren't my stories to tell. About 20 years later, I came to the Lyndhurst Park Hotel to stay for a couple of nights on a weekend holiday to the New Forest. The feeling I had going in there was very strange. I had a restless night and couldn't sleep, so I got up to go and get a nightcap from the bar. I opened the door of my room, looked down the corridor, and standing at the end of it, just standing there and watching me, was the old man, exactly as he was 20 years ago. I stared at him, backed off into my room, packed and left that night. I haven't been back to Lyndhurst since. I got talking to a local historian in the Hobbit pub in Southampton a couple of years ago, and after a few Guinnesses, I related my stories. Apparently, Duke Stackpole had lived and died there in the early 1800s, back when it was a mansion called Glasshaze. According to him, the builders who first worked on turning the place into a hotel would see his ghost regularly, starting fires and telling them to leave. According to local stories, once a year, on the anniversary of his death, music can be heard in parts of the house, and anyone who finds its source is whisked away to join the Duke's Dance of the Dead. Those are the stories, anyway, and I can't account for any but my own. The one thing I do know is that I won't be returning in a hurry to investigate. Trip to Bearhead Lake. The summer between junior year and senior year of high school, I got to take my best friend with me on a family vacation. I was really excited about it because she got to meet some of our family friends on the way up as we passed through my old state home, Iowa. I also got to take her to one of my favorite places in the world, Ledges State Park. All this was on the way to Minnesota to meet up with the rest of the family. Poor Lindsay ended up getting sick in Ames, so the trip was awful for her. We didn't know how to help other than to give her medicine and try to let her sleep. In Minnesota, we stayed the night in my aunt's apartment with my two cousins and my grandma. My friend had a little crush on my eldest cousin at the time, and they got along really well. When it was time to go to bed, she stayed on an air mattress in my cousin's room. I was a little jealous of the fact that my cousin was getting so much attention from my friend, so I had an air mattress to sleep on in the living room myself. In the middle of the night, she came out and woke my mom up. She had a really high fever and she was uncomfortable in my cousin's room. We moved her bed out to the living room and my mom gave her more medicine. The next day, she told me that it wasn't just the fever that woke her up. In fact, she couldn't sleep because of it. She found herself staring at this nightlight the boys had. It was the soft light that would go from white to yellow to green to blue to red. That was the cycle, over and over. She said that while she was watching it, the light would turn colors that weren't in the cycle, such as purple. Her attention was then drawn to the box fan that was blowing near the boys' open closet. She said she heard a growl and the fan was violently knocked over. The growling freaked her out and the fan was broken, so she wanted to sleep in the living room with us. That experience didn't happen to me, but it directly relates to experience I mentioned in Bridget. Plus, it was something that happened on the trip, so I figured it belonged here. I really wish I could get my friend to start submitting experiences on this site too. She has a lot to share. I didn't know what to tell her about the growling. I had experienced dark things around my cousin's previous apartment. I just wasn't surprised that she would hear something like that in their room. I also didn't know how to console her, so I was happy we weren't spending another night there. She was pretty happy about that too. The next day, we went further north. I think we camped in Tikahoshi State Park for a few nights. We visited another place in the world that I hold dearly, Grand Marcis. During our stay in that area, we hung out at Split Rock Lighthouse, where Lindsay drank some Lake Superior water. Her fever promptly subsided, and she felt much better. Thankfully, halfway through our vacation, we left the Tegahushi Grand Marcis area to go to Bearhead Lake State Park to camp for a couple days. Lindsay and I thought Bearhead was pretty creepy. It was always really quiet, even though the park was full of people. There were cars, tents, and campers all over the camping area, but it was always extremely quiet. All the time. The first full day we were there, my best friend and I went exploring. We walked around the park, which was beautiful, but there was just something off about it. There was this one area that had a fish cleaning shack and a bathroom. I had to go, but she did not. So I left her in the fish cleaning shack to go do my business. The fish cleaning shack was uphill, next to the bathroom. This bathroom had running water and showers. It wasn't an outhouse or anything like that, but it was pretty basic structure. The entrances to each side could be seen from fish cleaning shack, as well as the small parking area next to it on the man's side. I went to the woman's side and hurried in. Just like most of the camp, I didn't see anyone in there. I went to the middle stall because it wasn't the handicap stall, but also wasn't the very first one. As I went to do what one does in a bathroom, I heard a car pull up. Almost as soon as I heard the car engines turn off, someone walked in. Naturally, I thought it was another lady, but whoever it was walked right up to my stall. They didn't stop at the first or the big handicap one at the end. They walked directly up to my stall. Under the door, I saw straight-leg blue jeans and large feet wearing what looked like men's running shoes. I admit, I panicked for a moment. It wasn't because I thought maybe a man was in the ladies' room. It was because this person just stopped in front of my door and stood there, facing it, without even checking the other two empty stalls on the other side. I felt vulnerable and alone. I really wasn't sure what I could do if this person tried to force their way in. I didn't even have the nerve to simply say that the stall was occupied. The person never knocked on the door. The feet, the shoes, and even the pants looked like they belonged to a man to me. But I know women can have big feet and wear men's clothes. I don't know who was out there, but they didn't say anything to me. They didn't knock. They just walked up to my door and stood there for what felt like a full minute. After that, they turned and walked right back out. I didn't hear a car start up, and I didn't hear anyone pull away. I was shaken, and I didn't want to be in the bathroom by myself anymore. I got out of the stall, washed my hands, and went straight back to my friend. As soon as I saw her, I asked her if she saw anyone go in the bathroom. I wanted details, and I didn't see a car anywhere nearby. I wanted to know who to look out for because that experience was really creepy. She told me that she saw a car go straight by at one point, but no one stopped at the bathroom. She didn't see anyone go in or out. From where she was standing, she had a clear line of sight to ladies' room door. I had to believe her. I told her what happened, and we avoided that bathroom until the very last day of our visit at Bearhead Lake. On the last day, we had the wild idea of using the showers in that bathroom. There were two of them, and it was safe because there were two of us. What could go wrong? We walked there with everything we needed to get clean and ready for the long trip home. No one was in the bathroom again. We had it all to ourselves. We knew someone was in there before because the floor in the showers were wet and someone had left a pink bottle of Suave in the corner of one of the biggest ones. We were talking and making jokes as we separated into the shower stalls. We were both about to start shampooing our hair when we heard a thump somewhere in the bathroom. I called out to ask if anyone was there, brave only because I had someone with me. My friend and I both peeked out of the shower doors at roughly the same time to see who had come in. Lindsay mentioned that it sounded like the sound came from the entrance door, but all the bathroom stall doors were wide open. There was no one in front of the mirror or the sinks, and we were in the only showers in that side of the building. It made us pretty anxious. We tried to laugh it off, but we both agreed that we needed to shower faster. I remember saying that I was pretty creeped out, and Lindsay told me she was too. I think we joked about possibly sharing a shower stall instead of showering separately, due to the creepy experience we had just had when another loud noise caught our attention. It sounded like something plastic was slammed down into cement. I looked out, and the Suave bottle that had been there in the corner inside my shower stall was splattered on the ground just outside the shower door. The lid had popped open with the force of its landing, and the pink-colored condition had sprayed out all over the floor. I still didn't see anyone around yet again, and immediately joined my friend in her stall. We took turns showering and kept an eye on the rest of the bathroom. Nothing else happened, but we got clean as fast as we could possibly manage. We didn't want to be in there a second longer than we had to be.
Hey guys, so thank you so much for tuning in. Please leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and share across all social media.